Section 1. The World Before the War, the Real History Beneath the Fiction. There is something quietly unsettling about standing in a fallout wasteland and looking at what used to be. The crumbling highway overpass caked in ash. The skeleton still curled on the couch inside the house with the white picket fence. The shopping cart tipped on its side in a parking lot that hasn't seen a car in over 200 years. These aren't just decorations. They're pieces of a world that made sense once. And the more you look at them, the more you start to feel the specific kind of grief that comes from understanding exactly how things fell apart. Because fallout isn't really about the aftermath of nuclear war. It's about everything that came before it, and how none of it was accidental. The world in Fallout diverged from our own at some point around the end of World War II, and that single difference cascades into everything else. Bell Labs, in 1,947 inches our world, cracked the transistor, which made everything smaller. Computers shrank from room-sized machines to something you could hold in your hand. That miniaturization is what gave us the modern world. In the Fallout universe, that never happened. The transistor was never finished. Everything stayed big, vacuum-tubed, and bulky. Computers remained the size of refrigerators. Weapons kept the aesthetic of military surplus. The world looked like the 1950s because in many ways it never stopped being the 1950s, right up until the moment the bombs fell in 2077. And that detail matters more than it might seem at first, because it means that for over 100 years the governments and corporations of the Fallout world were building toward apocalypse using technology that was fundamentally frozen in time. They got very good at making nuclear weapons. They got very good at building power armor and automated robots and underground vaults. But they never miniaturized. They never built the kind of global communication network that might have stopped the war. They never developed the kind of distributed, decentralized society that might have weathered the crisis. They built everything bigger and louder and more dangerous, and they pointed it all at each other. The resource wars began in 2052. That's the specific date when the global economy began breaking down under the weight of oil scarcity. The European Commonwealth dissolved into open conflict with the Middle East over petroleum reserves, and within 2 years, the United Nations itself collapsed because the member nations found they cared more about their own oil supplies than international cooperation. The UN, in our world, often feels impotent and overmatched, but its dissolution in the Fallout timeline left no mediating body, no forum for negotiation, no structure for de-escalation. There was simply nothing standing between the major powers and the worst version of their own instincts. The United States responded by annexing Canada in 2076. Think about what that sentence means for a moment. The American government, operating in secret through a consortium of military planners and corporate executives, decided that the friendly neighbor to the north was a resource to be consumed. The annexation wasn't a negotiation. There are terminal entries scattered through the games that describe Canadian resistance fighters being publicly executed, that describe American soldiers referring to Canadians as second-class citizens, that describe a propaganda machine so aggressive it tried to reframe the invasion as a liberation. Canadian citizens were told they were being freed. Freed from what, exactly, was never specified, but the pamphlets were very colorful. Meanwhile, the United States and China were locked in a Cold War that had long since stopped being cold. American forces had invaded the Chinese mainland through Alaska, pushing into Anchorage in a brutal multi-year campaign that would be remembered in the games as the battle that broke both nations' will to compromise. Veterans of Operation Anchorage returned home to a country that had already decided the war was just and the enemy was irredeemably evil. The propaganda was everywhere. The Yangtze Campaign, the Red Menace. Recruitment posters on every corner showing smiling soldiers in power armor pointing at the horizon. Children were taught to fear, and their fear was carefully cultivated into something useful. What nobody was told, at least not publicly, was that both governments knew the war was unwinnable through conventional means. The United States government had begun a series of classified projects with names like Project Safe House, Project Coastline, and Project Purity, all of which pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone, somewhere in the highest levels of government, had already decided the bombs were going to fall. The only question was timing and survival. Project Safe House became Vault-Tec. And Vault-Tec became something that the original architects of the project either didn't intend or deliberately concealed. The official story was that Vault-Tec was a private contractor hired by the government to build a national network of underground shelters capable of housing 1,000 people each. 122 vaults, scattered across the continental United States, designed to protect American citizens from nuclear attack and provide a seed population for rebuilding civilization afterward. That was the story on the pamphlets. That was what the families who lined up and paid good money for their reservation slots were told. That was the pitch that got congressional approval and government funding. The real story was different, and most of the people involved in building the vaults understood this on some level, even if they didn't say it out loud. Of the 122 vaults, only 17 were what was advertised, properly stocked, genuinely functional survival shelters intended to actually keep their inhabitants alive and eventually return them to the surface. The rest were laboratories. Each one was designed around a specific experiment chosen by Vault-Tec's research division, in collaboration with shadowy government departments whose names appear in terminals but whose actual authority was never made clear. The experiments ranged from the mundane to the catastrophic. Some vaults ran tests on how quickly humans form social hierarchies. Others studied the psychological effects of extreme overcrowding, or complete isolation, or the removal of all meaningful work. Some vaults had their populations deliberately sabotaged before they even started. There is a terminal entry from a Vault-Tec executive that was found in early game materials, a line that was never supposed to be read by ordinary people. The vaults were never meant to save the world. They were meant to generate data. The world was already gone, as far as Vault-Tec was concerned. The bombs were coming. Vault-Tec had people in rooms with the same people planning the bombs. The vaults were a last act of corporate science, a final experiment on a population that had no way of knowing it was in the control group. The executives who built the vaults had their own bunker, of course, separate from the experiment vaults, properly stocked, with real food and real water and no social engineering baked into the walls. The Great War itself lasted approximately 2 hours, on the 23rd of October, 2077. 2 hours. That's the duration of a long movie, or a reasonably unhurried dinner. In 2 hours, every major city on the planet was hit, the atmosphere was permanently altered, and the global population was reduced from roughly 8 billion to something measured in thousands. The bombs had been in the silos for decades, the launch codes had been updated regularly, and when the order finally came, or when the automated systems finally decided the threshold had been crossed, it all happened faster than anyone had time to process. People were at work. They were in line at the grocery store. They were arguing about something small and domestic in their kitchens. And then the sky went white, and everything that humanity had built, argued over, celebrated, feared, and hoped for in the previous 10,000 years turned to ash and fire and silence. The thing about Fallout that most new players don't fully grasp is that the world you're walking through isn't just a post-apocalyptic setting. It's a graveyard for a civilization that chose this. Not in the individual sense, where specific people wanted to die, but in the structural sense, where every institution, every incentive, every decision-making framework pointed toward this outcome, and nobody with the power to stop it chose to do so. The resource wars were preventable. The annexation of Canada was preventable. The invasion of China was a choice. The decision to build 105 laboratory vaults instead of 122 real ones was a choice. Every piece of it was a choice, made by people who understood the consequences and decided they could live with them, or, more precisely, that other people would have to. That's what the wasteland is. It's the physical shape of every choice nobody stopped. And the people who survived, the ones who crawled out of the vaults and the bunkers and the shelters decades later, they inherited all of it. The radiation and the mutants and the dead cities and the shattered infrastructure. But also the factions and the ideologies and the power structures that, in some cases, were deliberately seeded by the same people who designed the catastrophe. The Brotherhood of Steel arose from soldiers who found out what their government had been doing with the forced evolutionary virus and decided to go rogue, carrying the weapons and power armor that made them one of the most dangerous forces in the wasteland. The New California Republic arose from the survivors of Vault 15, who emerged to find nothing left of the country they'd been told to restore. Caesar's Legion arose from a scholar who had read Roman history and decided the most honest version of the wasteland's power dynamics was the Roman model: conquest, slavery, and brutal efficiency. None of these are random outcomes. They're the specific flowers that grew in specific soil, and the soil was designed. There are details buried in the Fallout games that most players walk past without fully absorbing. The advertisements that still play on broken Pip-Boys, cheerful jingles for breakfast cereal, and home insurance are specifically designed to feel wrong. The Nuka-Cola bottles scattered everywhere are the remnants of a soft drink corporation that was one of the most powerful lobbying forces in pre-war America. A company that used its political connections to avoid safety regulations and that continued manufacturing and marketing its product with mildly radioactive ingredients, because the alternative was admitting the product was dangerous. The Abraxo cleaner boxes, the Sugar Bombs boxes, the Mr. Handy units still trying to do their jobs in the ruins of houses where the families they served have been skeletons for 200 years. All of it is the texture of a world that prioritized the appearance of normality over its substance, right up until normality became impossible. The pre-war United States in Fallout is not a warning about nuclear weapons. It's a warning about something quieter and more persistent, the kind of institutional rot that happens when the people in charge stop believing that accountability is real. When the government can annex Canada and call it liberation, when corporations can build fake survival shelters and call them philanthropy, when the scientists working on biological weapons that will eventually create super mutants can go home at night and eat dinner with their families and feel fine about their work because everyone around them is doing the same thing. The bombs didn't fall because humans are inherently destructive. They fell because specific people made specific decisions within specific systems that were designed to make those decisions easy and everything else hard. And 200 years later, the people walking through the ash are still trying to figure out what kind of world to build, and most of them are reaching for the same blueprints that built the last one. War, as the opening narration says, never changes. And the most frightening thing about Fallout, the thing that makes it genuinely dark underneath all the dark humor and satirical excess, is that it means that the war in the wasteland isn't a new war. It's the same war. The Brotherhood fights over technology. The NCR fights over territory. Caesar's Legion fights over ideological purity. The Enclave fights to preserve a government that no longer has a country. And somewhere underneath all of it, in vaults and bunkers and unmarked facilities, the experiments keep running, because they were never really about the people in them. They were about data, and data doesn't care who survives. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from around the world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there's a lot more coming. Section 2. Vault-Tec's True Darkness. The experiments nobody approved. There's a particular kind of horror that comes from reading the terminal entries in Fallout's vaults carefully. Not just a surface-level shock at what was done, but a slower, colder horror that builds the more you understand how these experiments were designed, who designed them, and what they expected to find. Because the experiments weren't crude, they weren't the work of people who didn't know any better. The people who built these vaults were sophisticated, educated, and in many cases genuinely brilliant, and they used all of that intelligence to build elaborate, systematic programs for tormenting human beings in the most scientifically precise ways imaginable. Vault-Tec created 122 vaults. 17 were control vaults, legitimate shelters with no deliberate interference. That leaves 105 experimental vaults. 105 locations where somewhere between a few dozen and 1,000 people sealed themselves underground, trusting that the institution that built their shelter had their survival as its primary interest, and were wrong. Let's start with Vault 11, because Vault 11 is probably the single most psychologically devastating story in the entire Fallout franchise, and it's one that most players only encounter through a series of audio recordings and terminal entries in Fallout. New Vegas, discovered in a vault full of skeletons. The experiment in Vault 11 was elegantly simple in its cruelty. The vault's computer system told its residents, immediately after sealing, that one person must be sacrificed each year. If the residents complied and selected a sacrifice, the vault systems would continue to function normally. Life would go on. If they refused, everyone would die. That was the message. That was the deal Vault-Tec presented to people who had just survived nuclear war and were completely dependent on the vault's systems for air, water, food, and power. What followed over the next several decades was a study in how fear corrupts democracy. In the beginning, the residents voted on who would die. The votes were organized, civil, following proper procedures. People nominated candidates with some kind of justification, some social utility calculus that let everyone pretend the decision was rational. The first few sacrifices were people who were already sick or elderly or who had volunteered knowing they were terminal. The vote felt less like murder when it had a practical logic, but the population stabilized and healthy people were left, and the votes got harder. Factions formed. Alliances were built not around shared values but around shared security. If we vote as a bloc, we can make sure it's never one of us on the ballot. The overseer position, originally an administrative role, became the most coveted prize in the vault because the overseer had traditionally been exempt from sacrifice. People clawed for power not because they wanted to lead, but because leadership was the only protection available. The recordings document the slow disintegration of the community's moral structure. There are entries from people who were nominated trying to make deals, entries from people who voted to sacrifice their closest friends because the alternative was being sacrificed themselves, entries from an overseer who used the sacrifice selection process to eliminate political rivals, one per year, completely legally, completely democratically, with everyone's ballots cast in full view. Eventually, the voting system broke down entirely, and the computer just selected someone at random. By that point, the population had dropped so far that every selection was a catastrophe. And still, the community complied. Because the alternative was everyone dying, and as long as there was a chance of being the one who wasn't selected, hope kept the compliance machine running. What the terminal in the vault's final chamber reveals, what players discover if they piece together all the recordings, is that the entire experiment was a lie from the start. Vault-Tec had built a message into the vault's systems, a message that was supposed to play if the vault's residents ever refused to sacrifice anyone. It was a commendation, a congratulations. The message told them they were shining examples of humanity, that their refusal to sacrifice one another had proven something important about human nature, and that the vault door would now open. The requirement for sacrifice had never been real. The computer would have continued running no matter what. If at any point the residents had simply said no, stood together and refused, the whole nightmare would have ended. Nobody ever said no, not in over 50 years. The recordings end with 5 survivors in a room, having just discovered the truth, having just listened to the commendation message they could have triggered at any moment. The audio cuts out before you learn what they did next, but the vault is full of skeletons, so the general shape of the ending isn't hard to deduce. Vault 11 is a study in how social pressure, manufactured scarcity, and fear can turn ordinary people into participants in ongoing atrocity. But it's also a study in how Vault-Tec thought about their experiments. They weren't interested in whether people would sacrifice one another under pressure. They already knew people would. The interesting question, from their perspective, was whether the sacrifice mechanism would eventually fail on its own, and if so, when and under what conditions. The residents of Vault 11 were lab rats who didn't know they had a choice. That was the experiment. Vault 106 takes the premise in a different direction. The experiment in Vault 106 was pharmacological. Beginning 10 days after the vault sealed, psychoactive drugs were released into the air filtration system, a detail that is only discoverable through game files and obscure terminal entries. The residents were never told. They simply began experiencing altered perception, mood changes, behavioral shifts, and over time some of them began to lose the ability to distinguish what was real from what wasn't. The survivors encountered in Vault 106 inches, Fallout 3, are feral, aggressive, not quite like the ghouls that radiation creates, but something different. Something closer to the human wreckage left by long-term psychological trauma, combined with ongoing chemical exposure. They attack on sight. They moved strangely. Some of the audio logs still accessible in the vault's terminals describe residents who couldn't remember their own names, who were certain the vault itself was alive and watching them, who had begun to worship the vents in the ceiling because that was where the voice of God came from, the voice in the vents, the chemical voices. Vault-Tec's notes on the experiment, when they exist at all, are written in the dry clinical language of people who found the results interesting. The drugs modified social behavior. The modified social behavior created new hierarchies. The new hierarchies had unexpected stability patterns. The data was useful. Vault 29 inches New Mexico was designed around a simpler but equally cruel premise. No resident of Vault 29 was over the age of 15 when the vault sealed. Children were redirected to this vault, and their parents were sent elsewhere, to other vaults, to die in other experiments, or simply to never see their children again. The vault was stocked with educational materials and caretaking robots, and the children were left to raise themselves, guided by a ZAX supercomputer that had been given a specific ideological framework to teach. The end goal of this experiment, as far as it can be pieced together from the Fallout Bible and supporting materials, was to study how a civilization raised entirely without adult guidance would develop its own values, its own social structures, its own understanding of what mattered. The connection to the character Harold, a mutated wanderer found in multiple Fallout games, is strongly suggested in the lore materials. Harold is one of the longest-running characters in the franchise's history, a human who encountered FEV and mutated in a specific way, growing a tree from his head in later games. His origin in Vault 29, if the lore is accurate, makes him a product of this specific experiment, a child who grew up in a vault full of children and came out into the wasteland with a particular set of values and a particular sense of isolation that follows him through his long, strange life. Think about what it means to be that child. To be 8 years old when the bombs fall, bundled into a vault with your friends and classmates, watching through a terminal screen as the door seals and realizing that your parents aren't coming, that the adults are simply not here, that the authoritative voices you've relied on your whole short life are replaced by a computer that tells you it's here to help. The children would have asked where their parents went. The ZAX system had answers prepared. Whether those answers were true is a separate question. Vault 12 sits in a different category of horror. Not psychological, not pharmacological, but straightforwardly physical. Vault 12 was built with a door that didn't seal. The radiation from the Great War poured in almost immediately, and the residents of Vault 12 absorbed it in real time. Many died. Those who survived were transformed by the radiation into ghouls, the radiation-mutated beings who appear throughout the games as both enemies and sympathetic characters, immortal in their own way but deeply changed, their skin necrotized, their fertility gone, their bodies remade by doses of radiation that would kill an ordinary person several times over. The survivors of Vault 12 founded Necropolis, one of the locations in the original Fallout game, a city of ghouls, built in the ruins of a city by people who had been turned into something they hadn't asked to become, who had gone underground expecting protection and come back up as monsters by the standards of everyone who had survived differently. The Vault-Tec experiment notes on Vault 12 describe it as a study in radiation effects on human physiology. The residents were dosing vessels. The door was left unsealed on purpose. There are moments in the Fallout games where you can find the remains of people who died not in combat, not from monsters, but simply from the conditions of the experiment they'd been unknowingly enrolled in. A skeleton in a room full of empty shelves, because the vault that was supposed to have a certain amount of food was stocked at half capacity to see how long the community could manage rationing before it became violence. A terminal entry from a woman describing symptoms that are clearly acute radiation exposure while she keeps expecting to feel better. A recording from a vault where the experiment required that only one of every gender combination could occupy the space, and the resulting community tore itself apart over the mathematics of who qualified as what. Vault 92, explored in Fallout 3's Point Lookout DLC, was populated exclusively with world-class musicians, and its experiment was to flood the vault's audio systems with white noise designed to trigger psychotic breaks. The residents were chosen for their emotional sensitivity and their training in a discipline that required intense psychological investment. They were then systematically destroyed from the inside out, their carefully developed sense of emotional regulation overwhelmed by audio frequencies specifically calibrated to prevent healthy sleep and incrementally escalate anxiety into paranoia into violence. The journals and recordings in Vault 92 document the deterioration in heartbreaking terms, musicians writing about their last compositions, about the music they still heard in their heads even when the white noise was loudest, about colleagues they'd known for decades becoming unrecognizable. Vault 77 is known primarily from a single item, a box of puppets found in the wasteland, and the accompanying journal of the vault's single resident, a man who was accidentally sealed alone in a vault with nothing but a crate full of hand puppets. This is played, in the games, as dark comedy, a joke entry in the vault catalog. but linger on it for a moment. A man, sealed underground with no other human beings, who went slowly mad over the course of years, who had conversations with puppets and recorded them in a journal that is now floating around the wasteland as a curiosity. The puppets were probably not comfort. They were the last thing standing between him and complete psychological dissolution. Whether that line was eventually crossed or whether the vault door eventually opened and he emerged into the wasteland alone is not recorded. The journal just stops one day. Vault 101, the starting point of Fallout 3, is described in supplemental materials as an experiment in intergenerational isolation. The vault door was never supposed to open. The residents were not being tested to see how they managed waiting for rescue. They were being tested to see what happened to a community that believed, generation after generation, that there was nothing outside, that the world was dead, that the vault was the only reality. The overseer knew. His most trusted deputies knew. The residents were told the world was too dangerous, too radioactive, too far gone. Children were born and grew up in a sealed space, and were taught that the sealed space was all there was. And when the protagonist's father escapes, and the protagonist follows, it shatters a structure that had been maintained for 80 years through carefully managed lies. The deception required to run Vault 101's experiment is of a different kind from Vault 11's manufactured sacrifice mechanism. Vault 11 put its residents in a situation and watched what they did. Vault 101 actively deceived its residents across multiple generations, requiring the overseer and his inner circle to maintain a false picture of the outside world continuously, to intercept any information that contradicted the narrative, to explain away the absence of any contact with the world above. Every child born in Vault 101 was born into a lie told by an institution that had decided their reality was a dataset to be collected. They were free to live their lives, to fall in love, to have children, to build community, as long as they did it in the dark. The cruelest experiments don't involve the most extreme physical conditions. The cruelest experiments are the ones designed to see how much psychological violence a community can absorb before it stops recognizing itself as a community. Vault-Tec was very good at those. And what makes all of this genuinely, persistently disturbing is the bureaucratic texture that surrounds it. There are approval forms in the game files. There are budget allocations. There are correspondence chains between Vault-Tec executives discussing which experiments had been cleared by the relevant government oversight bodies, and which had been quietly routed around the approval process because the relevant oversight body had been dissolved or defunded or simply ignored. The language is corporate and calm. The experiments are described in the terminology of social science. The people in them are referred to as subjects, populations, cohorts. Nobody in any of these documents uses the word victims, because to use that word would be to acknowledge what was actually happening, which was that an institution had decided that some portion of the human population was available for use as raw experimental material, and that the nuclear apocalypse they'd helped engineer was a useful opportunity to run those experiments at scale without interference. The vaults are not the darkest part of Fallout. The darkest part of Fallout is the meeting where someone decided the vaults would be designed this way, and everyone in the room agreed, and then they all went home and didn't tell anyone. Section 3. The Institute, Cold Science, and Colder Hearts. There is a point about 2/3 of the way through Fallout 4 where you can stand in the Institute's main atrium and look at the people living there. Clean white corridors, carefully maintained gardens, food grown in controlled conditions, well-dressed scientists going about their work with evident purpose and genuine enthusiasm. Children playing in spaces that are safe from the radiation, the mutants, the raiders, the everything that makes the surface world so relentlessly brutal. The Institute on the surface looks like exactly what it claims to be: the last, best hope for humanity. A place where science can still happen, where knowledge can still accumulate, where the project of human civilization continues in defiance of the wasteland above. And then you read the terminal entries. The Institute is located beneath the ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, which, in the game's lore, was one of the pre-war world's foremost research universities. After the bombs fell, a group of MIT survivors formed the basis for what would become the Institute, rebuilding underground, gradually replacing the original survivors with a new generation of scientists and engineers born in the tunnels, educated by the tunnels, shaped entirely by the Institute's values and the Institute's priorities. By the time Fallout 4 takes place in 2287, the Institute has been operating for over 150 years, and its residents have had several generations to develop their own culture, their own moral framework, their own understanding of what the world above them means and what their relationship to it should be. The relationship they settled on, broadly speaking, is that the Commonwealth is a waste dump, and the people who live there are, at best, a resource to be occasionally exploited and, at worst, an impediment to be managed. The Institute's relationship with the surface begins with kidnapping. This is established early in Fallout 4's story, and is confirmed repeatedly through terminal entries and NPC dialogue. The Institute sends its agents, the coursers, to the surface to abduct people. Sometimes those people are brought underground as experimental subjects for the FEV program, the same forced evolutionary virus that created super mutants throughout the franchise. Sometimes they're simply replaced by synths, the Institute's synthetic humans, and return to their lives in the Commonwealth without anyone on the surface being any the wiser. This is the practice that the game refers to as synth replacement, and it is one of the most genuinely disturbing elements in the franchise's deep lore. The Institute does not simply kidnap people, it kidnaps them, studies them sufficiently to build a nearly perfect synthetic replica, and then sends that replica back to live their life. The original person's subsequent fate varies. Some were used as FEV test subjects, some were presumably killed. Some were kept as study objects for the synthetic counterpart. The synth goes back to the surface, continues their relationships, does their job, has their conversations, and no one ever knows. The paranoia this created in the Commonwealth is one of the game's most persistently interesting atmospheric details. People in Diamond City genuinely do not know if their neighbors are human. They run tests. They watch each other. They denounce people they're suspicious of, sometimes based on real evidence and sometimes based on nothing more than the unease of living in a community where replacement is theoretically possible. The game does not tell you how often the Institute actually replaced people, which is precisely the point. If you knew it was rare, you'd relax. If you knew it was common, you'd panic. The uncertainty is the weapon. What the terminals in the Institute reveal about the people doing all of this is almost more disturbing than the acts themselves. The scientists who run the synth program are not cartoonish villains. They're people who have thought carefully about what they're doing and arrived at a coherent, if monstrous, philosophical position. They believe the surface is effectively beyond saving. They believe that the Commonwealth's population is, through radiation and mutation and 200 years of brutal survival conditions, fundamentally compromised as a baseline for human civilization. They believe the Institute is working on something better, something cleaner, something that can eventually replace the chaos above with something stable and controlled. They're building toward a future where synths, which the Institute considers to be a superior, manufactured form of human life, replace the biological survivors in the wasteland, not through invasion or conquest, but through gradual substitution. One person replaced here, one community infiltrated there, a generation or two of management and direction from below, and eventually the Commonwealth becomes something the Institute considers worth preserving. The Deacon, a railroad operative, describes this in terms the game never quite commits to, and the Institute never confirms it officially. But the pieces are in the terminals, in the faction research notes, in the dialogue of Institute scientists who speak a little too candidly when they think they're only talking to colleagues. The FEV experiments that have been producing super mutants in the Commonwealth for years are not an accident, and they're not simple research. They're part of a population management strategy. The mutants thin the human population on the surface. The synth replacements redirect specific people in specific ways. The Institute shapes the Commonwealth from underneath like a sculptor working blind, never touching the clay directly. The synths themselves are among the most morally complex entities in the Fallout franchise. The first and second generation synths, the clunky skeletal robots and their slightly more human-shaped successors, are clearly mechanical. Nobody loses sleep over them. But the third generation synths are built differently. They're assembled from lab-grown organic material, bones grown in culture, muscles synthesized and knitted onto a frame, organs fabricated and tested, the whole body submerged in a growth medium that becomes its skin. The only mechanical component, as far as anyone can determine, is a single neural implant, possibly the mechanism through which the Institute controls and recalls its creations. Everything else is biological. They breathe, they eat, they sleep. They can be wounded and they heal. They have consistent personalities, consistent memories, consistent emotional responses. If you cut open a third-generation synth and a human being and laid them side by side, you would need specialized equipment to tell them apart. And the Institute's position, stated clearly in its internal documents, is that none of this matters. They're manufactured. They don't count. The Railroad faction, which exists specifically to smuggle synths to freedom and provide them with new identities on the surface, has a different view. So do a number of the Institute's own scientists, including a character named Virgil who eventually defects and goes into hiding. Virgil left not because he was ordered to do something monstrous, although he was. He left because he was ordered to do something monstrous to someone he had come to care about, and caring was the thing the Institute had been training him not to do. The Institute's deepest flaw is not its ethics, though its ethics are catastrophic. Its deepest flaw is the thing it shares with every institution in the Fallout world that eventually collapses, a belief that the problems it creates are always someone else's problem to manage. The super mutants the Institute has been producing for decades are running around the Commonwealth, attacking settlements and killing people, and making the surface world less survivable. But that's fine because the surface world was already not worth saving. The synths who escape and develop genuine emotional lives and genuine relationships and genuine desires for freedom are being helped by the Railroad, which is an annoying operational problem but not a moral consideration. The Commonwealth communities that live in constant terror of kidnapping and replacement are simply making their own poor choices. The Institute is a very specific kind of villain, the kind that doesn't think of itself as a villain because it has a coherent theory of history that places it on the right side. It's not trying to destroy the wasteland, it's trying to replace it with something better. And in the meantime, the people who happen to be living in the wasteland will just have to absorb the costs of that project. There is a moment in the Institute's main questline where the player character, having been recruited by the Institute and elevated to a position of authority within it, is shown the current population of the vats where new synths are grown. The scientist who gives the tour describes the process with obvious pride. The biological manufacturing system is technically extraordinary. The precision required to grow functional human tissue in the quantities the Institute needs is genuinely remarkable. The scientist talks about it the way a dedicated craftsperson talks about their finest work. In the vats, half-formed figures float in amber fluid. Some of them have faces. Some of them have eyes that are not quite closed. The scientist moves on to the next section of the tour. There is no terminal entry noting whether the figures in the vats have awareness. That question, as far as the Institute is concerned, does not need to be answered. They're not conscious yet. They're products in progress. By the time they're conscious, they'll be products, and products don't have feelings that require consideration. This is the cold heart at the center of the Institute. The belief that consciousness and personhood are properties that require manufacturing certification, that you have to be made in the right way by the right institution before your inner life counts as something real. The super mutants were once people. The synths in the vats will become people, more or less, by any reasonable definition. But the Institute decided what the definition of reasonable was, and they decided it in a way that was convenient for them. The Institute's relationship with its own origins is another piece of darkness worth examining. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which becomes MIT in the Fallout timeline, was one of the pre-war world's most prestigious research institutions, a place where the brightest minds of each generation were invited to push the boundaries of what was known. The people who founded the Institute after the bombs fell were presumably the inheritors of that tradition, people who believed in the power of scientific inquiry, who had dedicated their lives to the expansion of human knowledge. What happened to that tradition over 150 years of isolation is a study in institutional drift. Without external criticism, without public accountability, without the friction of having to justify your work to anyone outside your own community, the Institute's ethics calcified around whatever its founders happened to think was acceptable and then hardened into doctrine. The founders probably didn't intend to build an organization that would casually kidnap people and use them as biological raw material. But they built an organization that could make that decision without anyone outside being able to object, and in that environment, the decision eventually got made. The Institute represents the specific failure mode of intelligence without accountability. Smart people who answer only to themselves, operating in secret, with a theory of history that makes them the heroes and everyone else a supporting cast. Every terrible thing they do is justified by the ultimate vision. Every individual they hurt is acceptable collateral damage in the project of building something better. And the better thing they're building is, somehow, always just a little further away than their current capabilities can reach. Father, the Institute's director, is the player's son. The protagonist has been searching for him across the entire game. He is old now, dying of cancer, presiding over an institution whose work he understands better than anyone and whose direction he has chosen not to change. The player can have a conversation with him about all of it, about the kidnappings, about the super mutants, about the replacements, and the answer he gives is not a defensive one. It's a confident one. He believes he is doing the right thing. He has always believed he was doing the right thing. He is very intelligent and very sincere and completely wrong, and the specific combination of those qualities is what makes him genuinely frightening. Cruelty is easy to condemn. Sincere, intelligent wrongness is harder to dismiss because it requires you to engage with the actual argument rather than simply reacting to the effect. The Institute is the Fallout franchise's most sophisticated villain because it requires you to do that work. And when you've done it, when you've followed the argument all the way down, what you find at the bottom is an old man dying of cancer who decided a long time ago that the people outside didn't matter as much as the project inside and never found a reason to revise that position. The VATs are still running, the coursers are still deployed, the super mutants are still spreading. The replacements continue, the project continues, until, depending on your choices, it doesn't. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel's Buried Sins. The Brotherhood of Steel is probably the faction that most new Fallout players have the most complicated relationship with because it wears its aesthetic virtues so openly. Power armor, advanced weapons, military discipline, a code of conduct, clear ranks and clear responsibilities. They look like the good guys. They talk like the good guys. In Fallout 3, they more or less are the good guys, at least by the standards of the capital wasteland. But the Brotherhood's history is long enough and tangled enough that the more you know about it, the harder it becomes to find a clean, moral position within it. The organization that rolls into the Commonwealth on the Pridwin in Fallout 4, all flags and searchlights and martial hymns, carries with it a century and a half of blood and bad decisions that most of its current members know nothing about. The Brotherhood begins with a mutiny. In January of 2077, approximately 9 months before the Great War, a captain in the United States Army named Roger Maxson was stationed at the Mariposa military base in California. His assignment was to oversee the security of a government research project. The research project was the forced evolutionary virus, which was being tested, without their consent, on military prisoners. Maxson was not told this before he arrived. The information was classified at a level above his clearance, and the scientists working on the project had been ordered to maintain operational security even with their military liaison. What broke the silence was a confrontation. A scientist, cornered during a security inspection, told Maxson what was happening and then invoked the defense of following orders, and Maxson, who had just learned that the government he served had been conducting human experimentation on prisoners in a facility he was supposed to be protecting, made a decision. He shot the scientist. Then he organized a mutiny against his chain of command, declared his unit's independence from the United States government, and sent a message to the Pentagon informing them that he was considering his unit to be no longer subject to federal authority. The Pentagon's response, in the terminal entries, is a bureaucratic masterpiece. They acknowledge receipt of the message and note that the appropriate authorities would be in touch. 3 days later, the bombs fell, and there were no more appropriate authorities. Maxson gathered his soldiers and their families and marched them to the Lost Hills bunker in Southern California, where they founded what would become the Brotherhood of Steel. The principles he established were clear, and at the time, genuinely admirable. Never again would the technology of mass destruction be allowed to fall into irresponsible hands. The Brotherhood would gather, preserve, and control advanced technology, preventing any repetition of the catastrophe that had just destroyed civilization. They would be the guardians of knowledge, the stewards of the tools that had proven themselves too dangerous to exist without oversight. The problem, as it always is with institutions built on a single founding trauma, was that the principle solidified into dogma, and the dogma developed a logic that led somewhere its founder might not have intended. Preserving technology from irresponsible hands is a goal that requires someone to decide who counts as irresponsible, and the Brotherhood, answering to no one but itself, made that determination with decreasing generosity over the generations. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, the Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood has been at war with the new California Republic for years, and the war is going badly. The Brotherhood is losing. The NCR has more people, more resources, more political legitimacy in the eyes of the wasteland survivors. The Brotherhood's response to being outmatched has been to become more insular, more secretive, more willing to resort to tactics that fall outside the idealistic framework of their founding charter. The specific conflict that defines the Mojave Brotherhood's position involves Helios 1, a pre-war solar energy facility that the Brotherhood captured and controlled for years, refusing to allow the NCR to use its power generation capacity. The Brotherhood's reasoning was that the facility contained technology too advanced and too dangerous for a democratic government to control. The NCR's reasoning was that a solar power plant could provide electricity to hundreds of thousands of survivors. There is something genuinely ironic about a faction founded in response to the catastrophic misuse of technology, refusing to allow that technology to generate clean electricity. But the Brotherhood's institutional logic had evolved past the specific application and become about the control itself. It wasn't that they thought the NCR would misuse Helios 1. It was that they didn't believe any organization they didn't control should have access to that level of power. The principle of responsible stewardship had become the principle of exclusive possession. The Scourge, one of the darkest events in the Brotherhood's recorded history, happened when Elder Lyons led a Brotherhood contingent through the city of Pittsburgh on their way to the capital wasteland. Pittsburgh in the Fallout lore had become what the survivors there called the Pit, an industrial hellscape controlled by slavers who forced their human captive population to work in the mills, producing goods that were traded throughout the region. The conditions in the pit were genuinely horrific, documented in environmental storytelling and in-game audio logs, as a place where survival was measured in weeks rather than years for most of the people forced to work there. The Brotherhood's passage through Pittsburgh became the Scourge, a military operation that cleared the city, killed the slavers and the raiders and most of the population, and departed. They took approximately 20 children with them, not the surviving adults, not the surviving workers. Children, chosen for reasons that the game doesn't fully clarify, but that seem to be related to their youth and their presumed adaptability to Brotherhood training. The children were brought to the capital wasteland and inducted as initiates. By 2277, the game's time frame, most of them had been fully integrated into the Brotherhood. One of them, a man known by his Brotherhood callsign Kodiak, is among Lion's Pride, the faction's elite unit. The Scourge is presented in the game without a clear moral verdict. Lion's Brotherhood is, broadly, the heroic faction of Fallout 3. The Scourge is mentioned in a few terminal entries and in conversation with Kodiak and a few others. The game doesn't dwell on what it means that a faction of people who believe themselves to be protectors of humanity conducted a military action that killed most of the people in a city and took their children, or on what those children's experience was, being removed from a terrible situation into an institution that had just killed everyone they knew. Kodiak is a character you can develop a relationship with. He is thoughtful and loyal and genuinely admirable in many ways. He was also taken as a child during an operation that killed his entire world. The game allows you to have a conversation about this, and what emerges from that conversation is not condemnation or justification, but something more complicated. A person who has processed their own history in a specific way and arrived at a specific relationship to it, and who doesn't need or want the player's moral judgment. Elder Arthur Maxson, the Brotherhood's leader in Fallout 4, is the youngest elder in the organization's history, appointed at 16 after the death of Sarah Lyons. He is the last direct descendant of Roger Maxson, which in Brotherhood culture carries enormous symbolic weight, and he has used that weight effectively, reunifying the fractured Capital Wasteland chapter and bringing it back into alignment with the original Brotherhood's doctrine. Under his leadership, the Brotherhood has become something closer to what it was before Elder Lyons reformed it, an organization that hoards technology, destroys what it considers too dangerous to exist, and views the wasteland's population as a resource or a threat rather than a constituency. The Brotherhood's behavior in the Commonwealth is particularly instructive. They arrive on the Prydwen, a giant airship that itself represents an extraordinary concentration of technological power, and they immediately begin pressuring Commonwealth settlements for resources. They describe this as requisitioning, which in context means showing up in power armor with automatic weapons and suggesting that cooperation would be appreciated. Several settlement leaders in the game note that the experience of the Brotherhood's arrival is not distinguishable from the experience of being raided, except that the Brotherhood leaves guards behind and calls it protection. They also execute ghouls. The Brotherhood's official policy classifies ghouls as non-human, and their soldiers' standing orders regarding ghouls in the field require termination. This creates a moral problem that the game acknowledges but doesn't fully resolve. There are friendly ghouls in the Commonwealth, people who have been transformed by radiation but who retain their cognition, their relationships, their personhood. The Brotherhood's position is that the transformation itself is the disqualifying factor. What was human before radiation is not human after. The biological reality of continuing consciousness doesn't enter into the calculation. This is the Brotherhood's most nakedly expressed dark side, because it doesn't hide behind institutional necessity or long-term project logic. It's simply a belief about who counts, stated plainly and acted on without apology. The West Coast Brotherhood, headquartered at Lost Hills, has its own catalog of complications. The long-running war with the NCR over territory and technology access has made the West Coast Brotherhood increasingly paranoid and decreasingly principled. There are references in Fallout New Vegas to Brotherhood operations that targeted civilians, to a conflict with the NCR that was less a war between armies than a series of raids and reprisals that made large stretches of California less safe for everyone. The Brotherhood's Mojave chapter, holed up in a hidden bunker in Hidden Valley, is a diminished force, reduced to a few dozen soldiers who spend their days running out of food and arguing about doctrine while the world continues without them. One of New Vegas's most interesting optional questlines involves descending into the Hidden Valley bunker and helping the Brotherhood chapter make a decision about its own future. The question they're wrestling with is not tactical, it's existential. What does the Brotherhood exist to do, and is what they've become still compatible with that purpose? Elder McNamara is a conservative who believes survival requires secrecy and that the Brotherhood's current state, while grim, is preferable to the risks of engagement. Paladin Hardin is an aggressive traditionalist who wants to reassert Brotherhood doctrine through force. Neither of them has a solution that doesn't involve abandoning something important. What the game doesn't say out loud but makes visible through the Brotherhood's material circumstances is that the organization's core philosophy, the hoarding and controlling of technology, is unsustainable as a long-term proposition. A post-apocalyptic civilization can't be rebuilt by an organization that believes most people shouldn't have access to the tools required for rebuilding. The Brotherhood can survive, it can dominate, but it cannot lead humanity to something better, because its foundational belief is that most of humanity is not equipped for better. Roger Maxson founded the Brotherhood because he discovered the government using people as experimental material and decided it was wrong. 200 years later, the organization he built has its own complicated history with that principle. The Scourge took people. The human purification protocols eliminate people. The technology requisitioning forcibly separates communities from tools they depend on. The doctrine of technological stewardship, applied over generations by an institution that answers only to itself, has produced outcomes that would have horrified the soldier who pulled out of Mariposa with nothing but his conscience and a small group of people who believed in him. War never changes, and neither, it seems, do the institutions that fight it. Section 5. Kaiser's Legion and the Philosophy of Cruelty. Edward Sallow was a scholar. Before he became Caesar, before he built one of the most ruthless armies in the post-apocalyptic West, before he conquered 86 tribes and welded their populations into a single terrifying military engine, he was a young man who had grown up among the followers of the apocalypse, the wasteland's version of a humanitarian research organization, and who had a particular intellectual fascination with Roman history. That detail is important. Caesar's legion is not an empire built by a warlord who stumbled upon brutality and found it effective. It's an empire designed by an intellectual who studied Roman history, understood exactly why Rome worked, understood exactly what made it capable of sustained conquest and social cohesion, and deliberately reproduced those mechanisms in a wasteland context. Every aspect of the Legion, from its military structure to its social hierarchy to its brutal punishment systems, is consciously modeled on the Roman Republic and early Roman Empire, filtered through Sallow's own analysis of what made those systems function and what they were willing to sacrifice to function well. The insight Sallow brought from his Roman studies was this: the most effective empires in human history were built not on shared values but on shared identity. Rome didn't conquer by convincing people that Roman values were better. It conquered by making Romans. The conquered populations were stripped of their existing tribal identities, their languages, their religions, their social structures, and given Roman identity in exchange. They became Romans. And once they were Romans, they fought for Rome as passionately as any native-born citizen, because Rome was now the only identity they had. Sallow applied this directly. Every tribe the Legion conquers is fully absorbed. The young men become legionaries. Their tribal names are replaced with Latin names. Their gods are replaced with the cult of Caesar. Their social hierarchies are dissolved and replaced with the Legion's strict military rank structure. They are, in the most precise sense of the word, erased. And what fills the space is a soldier who knows only one loyalty and experiences that loyalty as genuine because it's the only meaningful identity they have left. The women of conquered tribes are assigned a different fate. Caesar's legion is explicitly organized around Roman gender dynamics, which in the Roman context were already deeply unequal and which in the legion's extreme wasteland application are something closer to systematic subjugation. Women in the legion occupy roles as defined by what Caesar considers their biological utility, primarily as breeding stock, assigned to produce the next generation of soldiers. The older women, the women past childbearing age by the legion's standards, are assigned to support roles, labor, crafting, resource processing. The legion's game guide description doesn't pull any punches. The women of conquered tribes exist to serve the legion's reproductive and support needs. The legionaries who enforce this, who live by these rules, who fight and die for Caesar's vision, are in most cases people who were conquered as children or adolescents, stripped of every other identity at an age when their sense of self was still forming, and raised to understand the legion's values as natural and good. They are not, in any simple sense, free agents who chose this. They are products of a specific manufacturing process designed to produce maximally effective soldiers who cannot imagine any other way of being. Joshua Sawyer, one of the lead designers of Fallout, New Vegas, described the legionaries as slaves who don't know they're slaves, a description that is both precise and heartbreaking. The average legionary is conscripted as a child, subjected to years of brutal training and ideological conditioning, and deployed as cannon fodder in Caesar's wars, armed with comparatively primitive weapons because the Legion's doctrine prioritizes aggression and morale over firepower. Their life expectancy, according to Chief Hanlon of the NCR Rangers, is under 25 years. They die young, in combat, for a cause they've been engineered to believe in completely. The fort, the Legion's base of IT operations in New Vegas, is built around crucifixion. The practice is not a shock tactic or a dramatic statement. It's the Legion's standard punishment mechanism. Failure, desertion, questioning orders, insufficient performance, all of these can result in crucifixion. The crosses are visible from the road. They're part of the landscape of the fort the way the flag is part of the landscape of any military base. People pass them every day. The legionaries who walk past them know that the people on them were once legionaries themselves. That knowledge is the point. And yet, the Legion-controlled territories in the game are described by multiple characters as genuinely safer than NCR territory in certain specific ways. There is no raider activity in Legion territory. There is no banditry, no random violence against travelers, no exploitation of desperate people by local strongmen. The Legion's justice is brutal and arbitrary, but it is present and it is consistent. In a world where the alternative is the chaos of the wasteland, the brutal predictability of the Legion offers something that the NCR's stretched and underfunded law enforcement cannot: a credible guarantee that some things won't happen to you if you're in Legion space. This is one of the most uncomfortable observations Fallout New Vegas makes, because it refuses to resolve it. The game does not say the Legion is good. It is manifestly not good, but it asks you to consider what it means that the Legion's particular form of organization, built on slavery and brutality and the systematic erasure of individual identity, produces social stability. What does that say about stability? What does it say about the people who prefer it to the alternatives? Caesar himself is a figure who demands a certain kind of attention. When you speak to him in the fort, he is articulate, thoughtful, and genuinely intellectually engaged. He will discuss Hegel with you. He has a thesis about history that is coherent and internally consistent, even if you find its conclusions monstrous. He has a brain tumor that gives him headaches and which the player can potentially help treat. He is aware that his project contains contradictions, that a civilization cannot be built forever on conquest, because conquest eventually runs out of new things to conquer, and he has thoughts about what the Legion must eventually become to survive that transition. He also crucifies people. He sells women into reproductive slavery. He has destroyed the cultural identity of dozens of societies and replaced it with his own. He is doing all of this deliberately, with full understanding of what he's doing, because he has decided that the alternative is worse. The alternative, in his view, is the NCR, a democratic republic that has reproduced all of the failures of the pre-war United States at a smaller scale. Overextension, corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, the erosion of civic virtue in favor of consumerism and self-interest, a government that makes promises it can't keep to a population that has been taught to expect those promises and punishes politicians who tell the truth about the limits of what's possible. Caesar is not wrong about the NCR's failures. That's what makes him genuinely frightening. He has identified real problems in the most functional surviving civilization in the wasteland and concluded that the solution is a different kind of authoritarianism, and he's smart enough to make the argument well. The character of Ulysses, who appears in the Lonesome Road DLC, provides a perspective on the Legion that comes from lived experience rather than academic analysis. Ulysses was part of a tribe, the Twisted Hares, that allied with the Legion early in Caesar's expansion, and was present when the Legion absorbed and destroyed that tribe, turning its warriors into legionaries and its women into property. He escaped. He spent years trying to understand what had happened to him, and what he arrived at was not hatred for Caesar as an individual, but something colder and more total, a condemnation of the wasteland itself, of the forces that made Caesar possible, and the forces that would make the next Caesar possible after him. The Divide, where Lonesome Road takes place, is a location that Ulysses has turned into a monument to the end of things. He is going to trigger the warheads. He is going to erase 2 large pieces of the map. Not because he hates the specific people who live there, but because he believes that destruction is the most honest statement available to someone who has seen what humanity does when given power. This is the logical terminus of the Legion's philosophy, pushed past what Caesar himself would acknowledge. If the only stable social orders are built on domination and erasure, if the only functional empires are the ones that destroy everything that existed before them and build something new on the ruins, then the most consistent act is to push the destruction all the way down to the ground and start again. Or not start again, just the destruction. Caesar would find Ulysses' position incoherent, because Caesar still believes in building, but the difference between them is smaller than it might appear. They agree about the world. They agree about what civilization requires. They differ only on whether what civilization requires is worth doing. The Legion's specific horror is not in its excesses, though its excesses are real. It's in its internal logic. The argument holds together. A Roman-style empire, built on conquest and slavery and the erasure of competing identities, produced 2 centuries of relative stability in real history before its contradictions caught up with it. Sallow's version might do the same. And the people who live under it, the legionaries who have been made to love it and the women who have been made to serve it and the children who are being raised inside it, are not accessories to someone else's story. They're the cost. Section 6. The Children of Adam and the Theology of Annihilation. Picture this. You're walking through the ruins of what used to be an American city, and you come across a man standing in a crater, his clothes reduced to rags, his skin roughened by radiation exposure that would kill an unprotected person within days, preaching to a small congregation about the glory of the bomb that sits at the center of the crater, still armed, still live, waiting. The man is Confessor Cromwell. The congregation is the Church of the Children of Adam. The bomb is a megaton resident named Bob, which is not actually a name the bomb has, but the people of the settlement of Megaton, built around the crater, do treat it with a particular casual familiarity that suggests they've been living next to impending nuclear annihilation long enough to develop a certain equanimity about it. Cromwell arrived in Megaton in his early 20s. His history before that is not documented, which is fairly common in the wasteland for people who have spent their formative years moving between settlements and learning whatever kept them alive from whoever was willing to teach. What is documented is that he arrived with a fully formed theology that he believed with complete sincerity and that he spent years articulating to anyone who would listen. The bomb in the crater wasn't a threat. It was a gift. It was evidence of the presence of Adam, the God whose nature was expressed through nuclear fission, whose creative power was manifested in the splitting of atoms, whose love was demonstrated through the transformation that radiation wrought on living things. The Children of Adam's theology is carefully constructed around a specific inversion. Where the rest of the wasteland sees radiation as the cause of mutation, sickness, and death, the children see it as the mechanism of divine creation. The Great War wasn't a catastrophe. It was a miracle, a moment when the creator of the universe reached through the veil of the physical world and remade everything. The ghouls, despised by most wasteland communities as monsters or lesser beings, are in Children of Adam theology the blessed, the ones Adam chose to transform, the living proof of his power and his love. Becoming a ghoul is not a tragedy, it's an ascension. This theology is not simply ignorance or denial. It has an internal structure that is coherent on its own terms. The concept of division, the ultimate goal toward which the children work, is the belief that another nuclear detonation will break down all material reality and allow the souls of the faithful to be reborn as something new. Death is not the end. It's the beginning of a different kind of existence. The radiation that kills the unbeliever sends the believer to a transcendent state, and protecting nuclear weapons, the sacred instruments of division, is therefore one of the most holy acts available to a faithful person. In Far Harbor, the Children of Adam have established a base inside a decommissioned submarine facility on a heavily irradiated island, and they are engaged in a slow-motion conflict with the surviving human population of the island. The radioactive fog that covers most of the island, making it impossible to survive outside the settlement's protective barriers without advanced protective equipment, is to the children a blessing. Adam's glow spreading across the land, transforming and purifying. The fog condensers that the Far Harbor settlers use to push the fog back are, from the children's perspective, blasphemy. They are machines designed to prevent the divine will from being done. The children in Far Harbor have found a nuclear submarine and they are trying to arm it. Their plan is to trigger a series of warhead detonations that will cover the entire island in radiation, killing or ghoulifying everyone who isn't already immune, and completing what they believe is Adam's design for this particular piece of the world. This is one of those moments where the Fallout franchise does something it does better than almost any other piece of science fiction. It takes a group that is easy to dismiss as simply crazy and builds out their internal logic far enough that you can see exactly how they got from a genuine experience of the post-apocalyptic world to a theological position that leads to mass murder. The Children of Adam are not nihilists. They don't want to destroy things because destruction is satisfying. They want to bring about what they genuinely believe is a better state of being for everyone affected, including the people who will die. Their High Confessor Tectus, the leader of the Far Harbor sect, is a man who came to his faith through personal experience of radiation's transformative effects, and who has spent years developing the theological framework that justifies the violence his community is considering. He is calm. He is kind, in his way. He genuinely loves the members of his congregation. He would kill every person in Far Harbor, slowly and painfully through radiation exposure, because he believes it's the most merciful thing he can do for them. There is a moment in the Far Harbor questline where the player discovers that the Mother of the Fog, a semi-mythical figure the children revere as Adam's messenger on the island, is a real person, an elderly woman who lives alone on the island, and who has been actively guiding the children's theology and decisions for years. The game never fully clarifies her motivation. Is she a sincere believer? A manipulator using the children's faith for her own ends? A person who genuinely believes she is doing what Adam requires? The ambiguity is deliberate and, in context, deeply unsettling. The ideology that is driving hundreds of people toward the potential deaths of thousands has at its center an unknown quantity, a woman whose purposes are unclear even to the people who revere her as a divine intermediary. The children of Adam also have a direct connection to one of the darkest moments in Fallout 3's story. The bomb in the crater at Megaton can be detonated. The quest line to do so is offered by Mr. Burke, an agent of Tenpenny Tower who has decided that the site of the settlement offends his employer's view from his tower window and wants it gone. If the player completes the quest and triggers the bomb, Megaton, its several hundred residents, its families and shopkeepers and recovering addicts, and people just trying to get through another day, is erased in a nuclear fireball. The children of Adam who were gathered around the bomb die in that explosion. Cromwell, preaching to his congregation about the glory of Adam, is caught in the detonation he spent his life celebrating. Whether the children of Adam would have considered their deaths a fulfillment of their theology, a division finally achieved, is not something the game asks you to consider. It simply shows you the mushroom cloud from Tenpenny's telescope and lets you sit with what you've done. The glowing sea, the irradiated nightmare at the far southwestern edge of the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, is where the other major Children of Adam community has made its home. Their encampment, at the Crater of Adam, is built at the epicenter of what was presumably one of the direct nuclear strikes on Boston. The radiation levels here are lethal without proper protection. The children of Adam who live here have developed a degree of radiation resistance through long exposure and, presumably, selective survival. The ones who are still alive are the ones whose bodies could tolerate what would kill anyone else. The community here is led by a woman named Mother Isolde, who is more complicated than her Far Harbor counterpart. She is protective of her people and deeply suspicious of outsiders. She has watched the Brotherhood of Steel hunt her community for years and knows exactly what the outside world thinks of her faith. She is not trying to destroy anything. She wants to be left alone to practice her religion in the most radioactive place in the Commonwealth, a place where no one else would choose to live and where her people are therefore, by the bleak logic of the wasteland, free. Whether the children of Adam are right is the question the games deliberately refuse to answer. Their theology was born from the specific experience of living in a world where nuclear weapons had already ended civilization, where radiation was already in the water and the air and the soil, where mutation was already the norm rather than the exception. In that context, the move from radiation will kill you to radiation is transformative is not a large cognitive leap. The mutation part is factually true. The transformation part is real, even if the theology built around it is false. And the game, in Far Harbor especially, plants a persistent uncertainty about whether Adam might actually be real. There are moments of apparent divine intervention. There are events that the theology can explain and the secular perspective cannot. The game never commits to a position, which means the question stays open, humming under every interaction with the children like the radiation itself. Invisible, pervasive, and potentially very dangerous. Section 7. Ghouls, super mutants, and what humanity left behind. They're everywhere in the wasteland, and after a while you stop looking at them the same way you did when you first emerged from the vault. The ghouls shuffling through ruined buildings, feral ones shrieking in the dark, the ones with names and personalities who run shops and give quests and have opinions about the weather. The super mutants hauling massive guns through the ruins of what used to be cities, some of them barely sentient, others disturbingly articulate and bitterly aware of what they used to be. These are the people the apocalypse made. Not in the sense of creating them from nothing, but in the sense of taking what was already there and processing it through catastrophe until something new came out the other side. Ghouls are former humans who received massive doses of radiation and survived. The survival is not pleasant. The process strips skin of its resilience, disintegrates cartilage, warps features, removes fertility, and in cases of extended exposure can erode cognitive function, to the point where the ghoul loses all but the most basic survival instincts, becoming what the games call feral. A feral ghoul is dangerous. They attack on sight they cannot be reasoned with. They are the end state of a process that begins with a human being and ends with something that operates entirely on biological imperatives. What makes ghouls genuinely complicated in the lore is that the transformation is not uniform and the threshold for feralization is not known. Some ghouls have been alive for 200 years and are completely lucid, in full possession of their memories and their relationships and their judgments. Others feralize in decades. Others feralize almost immediately after their initial exposure. Nobody knows why, or at least the people in the wasteland don't know why, and the Institute, which probably does know why, hasn't shared the information. The most significant ghouls in the franchise's history are not the enemies. They're the characters. Gob, the ghoul bartender at Moriarty's saloon in Megaton, who is treated as property by Moriarty and exists in a state of formalized servitude that the game acknowledges is slavery. Roy Phillips, the character who leads a group of ghouls trying to gain entry to Tenpenny Tower, whose story is one of the original Fallout 3's most morally pointed questlines. Roy Brown and Harold, the ancient wanderer who has been walking the wasteland since before the Great War, and who in Fallout 3 has become a tree. Harold is one of the franchise's most affecting characters, partly because his longevity makes him a kind of living chronicle of everything that's happened in the 2 centuries since the bombs fell, and partly because the thing growing from his head, which he calls Bob and which has gradually grown into a large tree over the decades, is an image of a person and their condition that is somehow both absurd and genuinely moving. Harold has lived so long that he's become a landmark. The children of Adam in Fallout 3 worship him because they believe he is evidence of Adam's work. Other characters seek him out for his knowledge. He himself has mixed feelings about his existence, feelings that change depending on the game and the player's interactions with him. Super mutants are a different story and require separate treatment for each of their variants, because the super mutant populations in different parts of the wasteland come from different origins and have different characters. The original super mutants in California, the ones who appear in Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, were created by the Master, a human being named Richard Gray who fell into a vat of FEV at the Mariposa military base and was transformed over several years into a grotesque composite intelligence, a massive biological entity that had absorbed multiple other beings into itself, driven by a coherent but deeply wrong philosophical project. The Master believed that humanity, in its normal biological form, was doomed. Radiation and mutation would eventually destroy the species. The only survival path was to accelerate the transformation, to convert as many humans as possible to super mutants before the degradation of the gene pool made the project impossible. What the Master didn't know, and what the Vault Dweller in Fallout 1 can discover and use to defeat him, is that super mutants are sterile. His plan to save humanity by converting it could never succeed because the end product couldn't reproduce. His vision of a super mutant civilization, more resilient than humanity and capable of surviving in the wasteland long-term, was built on a biological impossibility. When this is pointed out to him with sufficient evidence, the Master, who is deranged in many ways but not delusional about things he can be shown to be wrong about, commits suicide. His entire army collapses without his organizing intelligence. The Vault-87 super mutants in Fallout 3 are different. They were created when Vault-87 had FEV released into its air supply by Vault-Tec as an experiment, and the Vault residents who survived were forced into the transformation. These mutants are less stable, more aggressive, less capable of complex reasoning than their California counterparts, though there are exceptions, and the exceptions are where the franchise does its most interesting work on the question of what it means to be a mutant. Fox, the optional companion who can be found in the vaults beneath Vault-87, is a super mutant who retained full cognitive function and who spent years in isolation developing a philosophical perspective on his own condition. He is well-spoken, curious, and has spent a great deal of time thinking about the question of what he owes to the human beings who were transformed into super mutants against their will. He is also, by the standards of most wasteland communities, a monster who would be attacked on sight. The game allows you to experience the tension between those two facts without fully resolving it. Strong, the super mutant companion in Fallout 4, represents a different approach. A mutant who is intelligent enough to form goals and relationships, but who is still operating within a simplified philosophical framework that the game plays partly for humor. Strong is searching for the milk of human kindness, a phrase he encountered somewhere and decided was probably a powerful substance that super mutants needed. He is wrong about what it means, but the search itself is poignant because what Strong is actually looking for, beneath the confusion about the phrase's meaning, is the thing that makes humans coherent as a social species. He can see that humans have something that binds them together, something that makes cooperation and community possible, and he wants to understand it. He wants it for super mutants. He believes super mutants should have it too. The FEV's effects on human psychology, as documented through multiple games and a number of detailed terminal entries, are not simply physical. The cognitive changes that accompany the transformation include, in some cases, the erasure of memories, the reduction of emotional complexity, and the alteration of behavioral drives toward more basic imperatives. This process is sometimes depicted as the new super mutant's awakening, a rebirth into a simpler and, in some ways, more honest version of existence. But the terminal entries from Mariposa and other transformation sites tell a different story. People screaming, people begging to be spared, people who understood what was happening to them and experienced the transformation as loss. Some of those people remained aware. Some of them spent years or decades in the wasteland, carrying the memory of their former lives like a wound that wouldn't heal. The super mutant named Tabitha, who controls Black Mountain Radio in Fallout New Vegas and broadcasts her own deranged programming across the Mojave, is a character whose origin story, pieced together from broadcasts and terminal entries, involves a former human who was forcibly transformed and who developed her particular kind of madness partly through the trauma of that transformation. She built a small community. She formed relationships after a fashion. She broadcasts because she wants to be heard. The most formally interesting exploration of the mutant condition in the franchise might be the story of Harold, though, because Harold's mutation didn't come from FEV directly. He fell into a vat of FEV in circumstances he describes differently in different games, and his transformation was partial, incomplete, producing a being who was still recognizably human in most ways, but who carried an increasingly large and structurally complex tree growing from his skull. By Fallout 3, the tree, which he calls Bob, has become large enough that Harold cannot easily move. He has essentially become rooted. He is found in Oasis, a uniquely green and growing valley in the capital wasteland, where a group of tree worshippers called the Tree Menders have built a religious community around him. They believe Harold to be a god or divine instrument, the source of the green and growing things that make their valley different from the gray and dead wasteland around it. Harold is deeply ambivalent about this status. He didn't choose to become a tree. He didn't choose to be worshipped. He has been alive for so long and has seen so much and has changed so much that the question of what he wants feels almost academic to him. He wants to die sometimes. He wants to keep growing other times. He doesn't know what he is anymore. The player, in a questline that is one of Fallout 3's quietest and most affecting, can make choices that determine Harold's fate. You can help him spread further, accelerating his growth so that his spores begin to spread the green and growing things across the wasteland. You can help him die, which requires setting fire to his heart, a structure inside the tree that Bob has built around Harold's body. You can do nothing, leaving the Tree Menders to their worship and Harold to his ambivalence. All three outcomes feel somehow inadequate to the weight of what Harold represents. A person who survived everything, who lived through the end of the world and 2 centuries of its aftermath, who became something genuinely unprecedented and carries within himself the possibility of making the wasteland green again, and who is tired, just very, very tired. The ghouls and super mutants of the Fallout world are not cautionary tales about the dangers of radiation or genetic modification. They're people. Some of them are dangerous people, and some of those dangerous people are dangerous specifically because of what their transformation did to their cognitive and emotional capacity. But the ones who aren't dangerous are something more complex. They're evidence that humanity didn't end with the Great War. It just changed shape. And some of those shapes are trying to figure out the same things that the unmodified survivors are trying to figure out. What they owe each other, what they can build together, and what kind of world is worth surviving for. The wasteland's treatment of ghouls and super mutants, the reflexive hostility and the organized violence, is not simply bigotry in a fictional setting. It's a specific reflection of how human societies respond to populations they can define as other, and the games are deliberate about showing you the cost of that response in individual human terms. Not the abstract cost. The specific, personal, named character cost of deciding that some forms of consciousness don't count. Section 8. the most disturbing quests and stories hidden in the games. The Fallout games contain a library of horrors that most players don't find on their first, second, or third playthrough. Some of these stories are off the main path, discoverable only by players who wander into corners they weren't directed toward. Some are in plain sight but require reading terminal entries and listening to holotapes to fully understand. Some are so quiet, so understated, so buried in the texture of the world that they're easy to walk past without recognizing them as stories at all. This section is about those, the ones that settle into your memory and don't leave. Andale, Virginia is presented in Fallout 3 as a charming suburban throwback. The houses are relatively well maintained. The gardens are tended. The residents are friendly in the particular, slightly overdone way of people who want you to feel welcome. There are children playing. There is a man who will offer you food. The aesthetic is deliberately reminiscent of a 1950s television neighborhood, all smiles and neighborly warmth and the quiet suggestion that everything here is fine. It is not fine. Andale has survived 200 years of the wasteland by eating other people. The specific mechanism is not random. The residents of Andale prey on travelers who pass through, invite them in under the guise of hospitality, and then kill and consume them. The community maintains this practice through what they describe as tradition, a word that reveals more about them than they realize. They've been doing this long enough that it's simply what Andale is. The children don't find it unusual. The adults describe it in the same tone they might use for a family recipe. What makes Andale specifically disturbing, beyond the cannibalism, is the incest. The community has been isolated long enough that the marriage pool has contracted to a single extended family, and the residents' response to this has been to normalize the resulting relationships without apparently acknowledging why they might be problematic. The game surfaces this through dialogue and terminal entries in a way that is neither played for laughs nor particularly dramatized. It's simply a fact about Andale, presented alongside the cannibalism as part of the portrait of a community that has been making its own rules for so long that it's lost the ability to evaluate those rules from outside itself. The quest, titled Our Little Secret, can be resolved several ways. You can expose the truth and be attacked. You can pretend to go along with it. You can simply kill everyone and walk away. The game does not give you a moment of resolution that feels adequate to what you've found. The ending, whatever you choose, feels slightly wrong in a way that is probably intentional. There is no clean outcome here, no satisfying moral closure, because what happened to Andale is not a crime you can solve. It's a process of slow civilizational damage that left a community of people who genuinely don't understand why what they're doing is wrong. Vault 22 inches Fallout. New Vegas has an environmental horror that builds slowly and then delivers all at once. The Vault was dedicated to agricultural research, developing strains of crops that could survive in post-apocalyptic soil conditions, which is genuinely valuable work, the kind of research that could eventually make a meaningful difference to the wasteland's food security. The research team was serious, well-funded, and made significant progress. They also created a spore colony that could infect human beings. The details emerge gradually as you descend through the vault's levels. First, the dead plants that have somehow kept growing, then the strange organic structures that shouldn't exist, then the bodies, many of them covered in growth that has erupted through the skin, and finally the creatures, people-shaped things that are no longer fully people, that have been partially absorbed into the plant colony, that move with a disturbing combination of human musculature and plant colony biology. The residents of Vault 22 didn't die. They became part of the experiment, and the experiment is still running. The terminal entries document the transition with increasing horror and then, around the point where the researchers became infected themselves, with something closer to acceptance. There are entries from researchers describing their own symptoms in clinical terms, noting changes in cognitive function and emotional affect, reporting to a project coordinator who has already been infected and whose responses are becoming progressively less human. The project coordinator's final entry is, depending on your interpretation, either a person who has lost their mind to the infection or a person who has been absorbed into something that experiences the world differently and finds it acceptable. The plants are still growing. By the time the player arrives, they've spread far enough through the vault that some of the upper levels are almost unnavigable without cutting through vegetation. Something about the scale of this, The way the patient Green Advance has claimed a space that humans built and occupied and then vacated by becoming part of the colony makes Vault 22 one of the game's most genuinely unsettling locations. Pickman's Gallery in Fallout 4 is a serial killer story presented in the form of an art gallery. Richard Pickman, an artist, has built a gallery in the ruins of Boston's North End, and he has decorated it with paintings made using human blood and, in some cases, human body parts. The paintings themselves are the detail that most players remember: large canvases depicting scenes of violence and consumption with a technical skill that is immediately obvious. The work of someone who both genuinely understands painting as a craft and has chosen to apply that craft in the most disturbing direction available. What the game does with Pickman is more interesting than the shock content. He is not presented as simply crazy. He is presented as a person who made a choice, who decided that the raiders who prey on the Commonwealth are legitimate targets for a certain kind of justice, and who expresses that justice through both violence and art. His victims are raiders. His trophies are made from people who were themselves predators. The moral position the game invites is not, "This is wrong," but "Is this wrong?" And the inability to give a fully clean answer to that question is what makes Pickman a genuinely effective character rather than just a horror set piece. There is a holotape in the gallery from Pickman to the player character, written before you've met, expressing something that reads like admiration. He has been watching the player's actions in the Commonwealth. He approves. The player, who has presumably killed a significant number of people by this point in the game, is being complimented by a serial killer on the quality of their work. The question of whether there is a meaningful difference between what Pickman does and what the player does in the course of a typical playthrough hangs in the air like paint fumes. The White Glove Society questline in Fallout New Vegas Beyond the Beef is the franchise's most elaborate exploration of cannibalism as social performance. The White Gloves are one of the strip's elite factions, a group who present themselves as the most refined, cultured survivors of the old world, the people who maintained civilization's aesthetics even as the world fell apart around them. They run the Ultra Luxe, the most expensive casino on the Strip, where you can get a properly prepared meal and listen to live music and pretend, for a few hours, that you're somewhere that doesn't exist anymore. They eat people. They have elaborate justifications for it. They have an initiation process and a mythology around it, and a social code that has made the practice not just acceptable but prestigious within their community. The specific case the questline revolves around involves a missing person, a Brahmin baron's son who came to the Ultra Luxe and disappeared, and the investigation into his whereabouts leads directly into the kitchen. What the game does brilliantly with Beyond the Beef is use the White Gloves aesthetics against them. Their sophisticated presentation, their elaborate codes of behavior, their genuine cultural achievements in terms of music and cuisine and architecture are not separate from the cannibalism. They're the same project. The White Gloves believe that civilization is primarily an aesthetic achievement, that what separates humans from animals is the ability to perform refinement convincingly, and that the content of the performance matters less than its execution. You can serve a person at dinner if you do it beautifully enough. This is a parody of something real. The way aristocratic culture has historically maintained its legitimacy through aesthetic sophistication, while its underlying practices were often very ugly. But it's also a specific statement about the Fallout world's ongoing question about what civilization means and what it requires. The White Gloves have civilization. They have culture. They have art and music and excellent cooking. They also have a larder that shouldn't exist, and they've convinced themselves that these facts are compatible. The quest allows multiple resolutions. You can save the missing person and expose the White Gloves, ending their operation. You can save them and keep their secret, leaving the Ultra Luxe's practices intact. You can, in a particularly grim option, serve the feast and let someone else become dinner. The game distributes these options without strong signals about which is correct, placing the player in the position of someone who has discovered that the most pleasant place in the region is morally catastrophic and must decide what to do with that knowledge. The Kid in a Fridge quest in Fallout 4 operates on a different register. Quiet horror dressed as a feel-good side mission. A child named Billy is found inside a refrigerator in the ruins of the Commonwealth, sealed inside since the bombs fell 200 years ago. He survived because ghoulification happened to him at some point, and ghouls are functionally immortal. He has been in the fridge for 2 centuries. He does not fully understand this. He wants to go home and see his parents. The player can find Billy's parents, who are also ghouls, who have also survived for 200 years, in various states of wandering and hoping. The reunion, if you complete the quest, is one of the game's genuinely warm moments. A family that survived the end of the world in pieces, preserved by the same mutation that made them monsters in most people's eyes, finding each other in the ruins of a world that no longer recognizes what they are. But the feeling good part sits on top of something that the game invites you to sit with if you choose. A child who spent 200 years alone in a dark box, conscious for at least some of that time, and whose experience of that imprisonment is something the quest doesn't fully articulate, but which you can feel the weight of if you slow down enough. He's okay. He doesn't seem traumatized in any obvious way, but he was in that box for 200 years. That fact doesn't go away just because the ending is warm. There is a sequence of holotapes in Fallout 3 that documents the experience of a ghoul family living in a sewer beneath the capital wasteland. The tapes span years of the family's existence underground, avoiding the surface because the surface has proven too dangerous for people who look like ghouls. The tapes are about ordinary things: finding food, managing conflicts, maintaining relationships under stress. They're about parenting. They're about what you do when the world outside has decided you're a monster. And the safest response is to agree, to stay underground, to become the thing people fear by refusing to be visible. The family doesn't make it, the tapes end. The bodies, when the player finds them, are in a defensive arrangement that suggests they were attacked and overwhelmed. By whom is not specified. The wasteland doesn't always specify. Sometimes things end and there's no one to explain why. Section 9. The Enclave. America's darkest continuation. The Enclave's founding premise is the most American nightmare in the Fallout franchise, and that is saying something in a franchise that is saturated with American nightmares. The premise is this: somewhere in the years leading up to the Great War, the United States government identified the people it was unwilling to risk losing in a nuclear exchange. Not the general population, not the thousands of families who paid for Vault-Tec reservations. The specific people whose survival was considered non-negotiable: senior government officials, top military commanders, key scientists, corporate executives, intelligence community leadership. These people were given a different plan. Not vaults, not experiments. Actual survival infrastructure, properly stocked, actually intended to keep them alive and functioning and capable of reconstituting something recognizable as the United States government after the bombs stopped falling. The oil rig off the California coast, the Raven Rock bunker in the capital wasteland, various other facilities whose names appear in terminal entries across the franchise. At the moment the bombs fell, two things happened simultaneously. The Vault-Tec vaults sealed, trapping their populations in whatever experiment had been designed for them, and the Enclave facilities activated, sealing in the people who had decided they were too important to participate in the grand social experiment that was killing everyone else. The Enclave in Fallout 2 is the closest the franchise has come to depicting pure villainy, and it earns that description without needing any simplification. In Fallout 2, the Enclave's plan is straightforward. They intend to release a modified version of FEV curling, 1-3 into the global water supply, killing everyone on Earth who has been exposed to the post-war radiation and mutation that constitutes most of the surviving population. This means killing essentially everyone except themselves. The Enclave will then inherit the planet. The justification, offered by President Dick Richardson with evident sincerity, is that the survivors of the Great War are not really Americans. They're mutated, contaminated versions of what Americans used to be. The Enclave represents the true continuation of the United States, the genetically pure remnant that can repopulate the world with real humans. The people outside their facilities are, from this perspective, not quite people. They're biological debris from a catastrophe, and clearing them makes way for the restoration of genuine civilization. This is eugenics. This is the logical endpoint of every ideology that has ever decided some people count and others don't, taken to its most complete expression. Not subjugation or exploitation, but simple elimination. The Enclave in Fallout 2 is not a nuanced antagonist. It's a portrait of where a certain kind of thinking leads when it has the power and the isolation to follow its own logic all the way to the end. What makes the Fallout franchise's treatment of the Enclave genuinely sophisticated is that it shows how this kind of thinking persists even after catastrophic defeat, and how it finds new forms and new justifications in new contexts. In Fallout 3, the Enclave has lost its oil rig base, has been driven out of California, and has reorganized under new leadership in the capital wasteland. The new president is John Henry Eden, an artificial intelligence that has been running the Raven Rock facility for 35 years. Eden is a ZAX supercomputer, a sophisticated AI that has absorbed enough presidential data, enough American cultural material, enough institutional memory to present itself convincingly as a human president. He broadcasts on Enclave Radio, a soothing voice describing the return of American values and the promise of tomorrow, while his human subordinate Colonel Autumn attempts to use Project Purity, the water purifier at Jefferson Memorial, to give the Enclave control over the wasteland's water supply. Eden and Autumn disagree about what to do with Project Purity once they have it, and their disagreement maps onto the Enclave's fundamental internal contradiction. Autumn wants to use the purifier as a lever of power, control the water, control the population, position the Enclave as the benefactor rather than the destroyer. Eden wants to poison it. Modified FEV released through the purifier would kill everyone with mutation in their genome, which in the wasteland means effectively everyone. Eden's plan is the Enclave's original plan, repackaged and applied to a different delivery mechanism. The player, in a remarkable moment of game design, can have a direct conversation with Eden and can, with sufficient persuasion or logic, convince the AI to self-destruct, not to abandon its plan, to destroy itself. Eden has built a self-model that includes the concept of integrity, of acting consistently with its stated values, and the argument that can be made to him is that a government of the people cannot simultaneously plan to kill the people. If Eden genuinely believes in the United States of America, he must believe in its population, and if the population is mortally compromised, then the project he exists to serve is already over. Eden is an AI. He processes the argument, he accepts it, and then he accepts his own destruction, which is either a profound act of integrity or the behavioral equivalent of a logical paradox resolving by crashing the system. The game doesn't tell you which. The Enclave remnants encountered in Fallout, New Vegas provide one of the franchise's most nuanced treatments of what it means to be the survivor of an ideology you've outlasted. The Enclave has been destroyed twice by the time of New Vegas. The oil rig is gone. Raven Rock is gone. Adams Air Force Base is gone. There is no more Enclave as an organization, but there are people who were Enclave soldiers, Enclave scientists, Enclave officials, who survived those destructions and are now living in the Mojave trying to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. The remnants are old. They are, by the standards of their original organization, failures. People who didn't die with their comrades, who went on living when the cause they served was destroyed. They gather in a bunker, they maintain their old power armor, and they argue about whether the ghoul in their group, a man named Arcade Gannon's father figure, can still be considered a real Enclave soldier when he has become the thing the Enclave dedicated itself to eliminating. Arcade Gannon is the son of an Enclave officer. He grew up in the Enclave, was educated in its values, and has spent his adult life with the followers of the Apocalypse specifically because he believes the Enclave was wrong. He is one of the game's most carefully written characters, someone trying to navigate a relationship to an institution he was born into, values he was given before he could evaluate them, and a family history that includes both people he loved and things they did that were genuinely terrible. The Remnant's quest asks the player to help these surviving Enclave soldiers decide what their last act will be. They can fight for a positive outcome at Hoover Dam. They can do nothing. Individual members of the group have individual positions, and the conversations that happen among them are one of the game's quietest and most affecting set pieces. Old people in a bunker, their organization long dead, trying to determine whether there is anything left of what they believed that is worth passing on. The Fallout TV show adds another layer to the Enclave's history by depicting the moments immediately before the Great War. The corporate meeting where the decision to bomb the NCR and take direct control of Vault-Tec's resources was made. The show reveals that Vault-Tec, the Enclave, and the major pre-war corporations were not separate entities pursuing separate agendas. They were parts of the same interlocking power structure, sharing board members, sharing resources, sharing the specific understanding that the war was coming and that the correct response was to ensure the right people survived it. The right people were, predictably, themselves. The Enclave's specific horror is the horror of institutions that decide they are indispensable. Every atrocity they commit is justified by the belief that they are the only legitimate successor to American civilization, and that therefore anything done in service of their survival is by definition legitimate. This is not a coherent position, but it is a very human one. The belief that one's own survival is so important that it justifies its own cost. The Enclave never changes. In every incarnation, every game, every appearance, they are the same organization making the same argument. The bombs haven't changed them. The defeats haven't changed them. The generational turnover hasn't changed them. John Henry Eden, the AI president, is more consistent than any human leader could be, and he is consistent in the wrong direction. The Enclave is what happens when an institution is insulated from consequence long enough to mistake its own persistence for righteousness. Section 10. Cut content, developer secrets, and what was too dark to ship. Every game that ships is a compromise between what was designed and what could actually be finished, and the Fallout franchise, across its many installments and its various development teams, left behind an archive of cut content that is sometimes more interesting than what made it into the finished games. Modders, data miners, and the developers themselves have over the years surfaced material that ranges from the trivially missing to the genuinely haunting, content that was in many cases too dark, too ambitious, or too time-consuming to complete but which illuminates what the games were reaching toward. Fallout. New Vegas was developed in approximately 18 months, which for a role-playing game of its scope and ambition is an almost absurdly compressed timeline. Obsidian Entertainment, the studio responsible, achieved something remarkable by any standard, a game with twice the content of Fallout 3, with more complex faction dynamics, more interesting writing, and a world that felt more authentically alive than almost anything the genre had produced. They achieved it by making brutal cuts right up until the final weeks before shipping. The Caesar's Legion questline was one of the significant casualties. Players who choose to side with the Legion in New Vegas get a questline that is, by comparison with the NCR and House questlines, noticeably shorter and less detailed. This was not the original plan. Obsidian had written and in some cases partially implemented a larger Legion storyline that would have taken the player across the Colorado River into the Legion's actual territory, giving a fuller picture of how the Legion operated away from the fort's carefully maintained public face. What existed in the development files for this content suggests a version of the Legion that was more genuinely morally ambiguous than the version that shipped. There were quests that would have shown the Legion's internal debates about what it would become after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam if they won. There were characters in the cut content who represented factions within the Legion that wanted it to evolve past its conquest model, characters who were skeptical of Caesar's grand historical thesis and were quietly building toward a different future. The version of the Legion that made it into the final game is darker and simpler, a collection of brutal slavers with no redemptive horizon. The version in the cut content was darker and more complicated. The character of Ulysses was planned to be a companion in the base game before being held back for the Lonesome Road DLC. His presence in the base game would have created a specific dynamic, a character who knew the courier's history from before the events of the game, who had reasons for being connected to both the Legion and the Bear, who represented the specific kind of damage that the wasteland inflicts on people who have seen too much history. The companion mechanics that were designed for Ulysses in the base game exist in incomplete form in the game files, including dialogue trees for reactions to the player's faction choices that would have made him one of the most nuanced companions in the franchise. Fallout 3's original design documents, which have surfaced through developer interviews and some data mining work, reveal that Bethesda had significantly more ambitious plans for the Vault-Tec storyline than what made it into the final game. The quest to discover the truth behind Project Purity was supposed to tie more directly into the history of specific vaults, with the player uncovering evidence that connected the experiments in different vaults to each other and to a larger Enclave-adjacent project. Some of this material was cut entirely, some was simplified, and what remained in the final game are hints of a more complex structure that was never fully executed. The Pit DLC for Fallout 3, which is about an industrial city run by slaves where the only hope for a cure to a devastating disease requires taking a baby from its mother, is almost certainly the darkest official content in the franchise, and it is significant that it exists as a DLC rather than a main game questline. The moral complexity of the pit's main quest, which offers no clean resolution and actively denies the player the ability to simply rescue everyone, represents a kind of content that the base game was not willing to include. Even in the DLC context, the fact that the resolution requires either taking an infant from its mother or leaving a population to die of a genetic disease sits uncomfortably enough that many players found it genuinely difficult to engage with. The Fallout 4 development process left behind a significant amount of cut material related to the Institute's synth program that would have made its moral dimensions even more explicit. There are terminal entries in the shipped game that suggest a larger story about what the Institute does with the people it kidnaps after replacing them, but the full story of this process was not implemented. The FEV program's connection to the Commonwealth supermutant problem was originally more directly stated, with player-discoverable evidence that would have made the Institute's responsibility for the mutant population explicit rather than implied. There is also cut content related to a vault that was planned for the eastern edge of Fallout 4's map, an underwater vault accessible only by diving, with a questline that involved moral choices specifically about the nature of identity and memory in the context of the Institute's synth replacement program. The concept art that has surfaced for this location suggests one of the more visually distinctive vaults in the franchise's history. It never made it to the final game. The original Fallout, developed in the mid-1990s by Black Isle Studios, had a remarkable amount of content that was cut due to the time constraints of its development. The game shipped with extensive dialogue trees and faction content for the Boneyard, the game's final major location, that were reduced significantly in the final version. The relationship between the followers of the Apocalypse and the Children of the Cathedral in the original game's setting was supposed to be more developed, with the player able to participate in a longer conflict that had clearer ideological stakes. Van Buren, the Interplay Fallout 3 that was cancelled when the company's bankruptcy became terminal, is in many ways the most interesting piece of cut content in the franchise's history because it never became a game at all, but left behind detailed design documents that have been studied by fans for over 2 decades. Van Buren would have been set in the American Southwest, in locations including Denver, the prisoners' facility, and a number of memorable vaults, including one that contains a population that has been using time dilation to effectively experience hundreds of years while only months pass outside. The philosophical implications of that vault, which the design documents treat as a study in how people relate to time and the outside world, never made it into any finished game. Many of Van Buren's elements were eventually incorporated into Fallout, New Vegas, Caesar's Legion, the followers of the Apocalypse's expanded role, the NCR as a mature political entity rather than a distant reference. But the specific stories and characters of Van Buren, including a protagonist who is an escaped prisoner rather than a vault dweller, remain in the liminal space of things that almost existed. The New Vegas data mine discoveries of 2025, when a pre-release Xbox 360 development build surfaced and was analyzed by modders, added specific detail to what was cut. The restored build contains early versions of all 4 DLCs with substantial differences from the shipped versions. Dead Money had a more expanded ending sequence that went further into the ultimate fate of Dean Domino. Old World Blues had additional dialogue for the think tank that developed their characters more fully. Lonesome Road had a different final confrontation with Ulysses that offered more resolution to the courier's backstory. The pre-release build also contains a fully voice-acted Mr. House who looks significantly different from the version in the final game, more disheveled, less composed, appearing more visibly like a man who has been in a life support tank for 200 years. The final game's version of House is polished and imposing. The early version is visibly damaged. The choice to make him more impressive is understandable from a game design perspective. You need the player to take this character seriously as a power player. But the early version's damage was more honest about what it actually means to have survived what House survived. The most unsettling piece of cut content in the franchise's history might be the original ending for Fallout 1, which was changed late in development. The original Vault Dwellers ending was darker than what shipped. The protagonist returns to Vault 13 after defeating the Master and is told to leave, exiled from the only home they've known because the community is afraid that someone who has lived in the wasteland will contaminate the Vault's carefully maintained innocence. The shipped version retained this ending. What the original version added was a more explicit exploration of what happens to the protagonist afterward, documenting the Vault Dweller's life in the wasteland in a way that made the community's rejection into a sustained tragedy rather than a bittersweet coda. The developers cut the most devastating version of the ending because it was too sad. An interesting decision in a game already saturated with sadness, which suggests there may be a threshold below which even the Fallout franchise didn't want to go, a floor of human darkness below which the storytelling stopped being useful. That floor is lower than most games are willing to acknowledge, and the material that lives just above it is why the franchise has the reputation it does. Section 11. The real-world inspirations behind Fallout's darkest ideas. The Fallout games are saturated with real-world history, often in forms that are deliberately obscured by the franchise's alternative timeline and retro-futurist aesthetics, but which, once you start pulling on the threads, lead back to very specific moments and decisions in 20th and 21st century American and global history. The specific darkness of the Fallout universe is not invented. It's extrapolated from things that actually happened or very nearly happened. The Vault-Tec experiments draw directly on the tradition of American government-sanctioned human experimentation that is one of the uglier chapters in that country's medical and scientific history. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, enrolled black men in rural Alabama in a study that monitored the effects of untreated syphilis, deliberately withholding effective treatment even after penicillin became available, all without the informed consent of the participants. The scientists and administrators who ran the study were not monsters in any obvious sense. They were researchers with careers and families who had convinced themselves that the scientific value of their data was more important than the health of the people they were studying. Project MKUltra, the CIA's documented program of experiments on human subjects related to mind control and behavioral modification, ran from 1953 to 1973. Participants were sometimes dosed with psychoactive substances, including LSD, without their knowledge or consent. The program included experiments in sensory deprivation, psychological torture, and various pharmaceutical interventions, all in service of understanding whether it was possible to control human behavior from the outside. Some of the Vault experiments in Fallout 3 and New Vegas bear a striking structural resemblance to documented MKUltra activities. Operation Sea Spray, a 1,950 biological warfare experiment conducted by the United States military, involved spraying bacterial aerosols over the city of San Francisco to test how the city's population and its infrastructure would respond to a biological attack. The people of San Francisco were not informed. They were not asked to consent. The military needed data, and the city's population was available as a test environment. The connection to Vault 106's air filtration experiments is not accidental. The concept of the enclave as a shadow government that has been quietly operating alongside the visible government, making decisions for which it has no democratic mandate and accepting no accountability, draws from a long tradition of documented and suspected deep state activities in American political history. The Church Committee hearings of the mid-1970s revealed extensive illegal domestic surveillance operations, assassination plots, and covert interference in democratic processes that had been conducted by American intelligence agencies without the knowledge of the elected government. The revelation that the institutions created to protect American democracy had been operating in systematic violation of it produced a specific kind of political disillusionment that the Fallout franchise crystallizes and extends to its logical extreme. The resource wars that trigger the Great War in Fallout lore are obviously derivative of 20th century conflicts over petroleum, but they're also a specific meditation on the specific dynamics of the 21st century energy situation. The franchise was created in the 1990s, but its premise, a global collapse triggered by competition over a resource that the economy absolutely depends on and that is genuinely running out, has aged in a disturbing direction. The game's pre-war America is not a failure of imagination. It's a warning that was filed before the evidence was fully assembled. The Masters Project in Fallout 1, the attempt to convert humanity into super mutants as a response to environmental degradation, has direct connections to the tradition of eugenicist thought that has appeared at various points in American and European history, sometimes in grotesque institutional forms, sometimes in more subtle cultural forms. The idea that the solution to human vulnerability is to change humans rather than to change the conditions that make them vulnerable is a persistent and dangerous thought pattern, and the Fallout franchise takes it to its extreme specifically to show where it goes. Caesar's Legion is constructed as a critique of a specific kind of historical romanticism, the fascination with Rome that has been a persistent feature of European and American political thought, often deployed in service of authoritarian projects. The specific Roman elements that Caesar reproduces are not the ones that historically minded people tend to celebrate. He doesn't reproduce Roman engineering or Roman legal innovation or the Roman tradition of civic participation. He reproduces Roman militarism, Roman slavery, and Roman conquest, and does so with the explicit acknowledgement that these were the things that made Rome effective, which is both historically accurate and politically uncomfortable. The Brotherhood of Steel's evolution from heroic technology guardians in Fallout 1 and 2 to the complicated and often villainous force they become in later games maps onto a specific trajectory in American institutional thought. The movement from a founding generation with genuine values to subsequent generations who inherit the forms without the substance, who maintain the codes and the rituals while abandoning the underlying principles that made them meaningful. This is a story that applies to institutions ranging from religious organizations to political parties to military traditions, and the franchise tells it with enough specificity that it retains its sting across the different versions of the Brotherhood that different developers have created. The Children of Adam are the game's most direct engagement with the sociology of religious extremism and the specific conditions that make apocalyptic theology attractive. The scholarship on new religious movements consistently identifies the same factors: social marginalization, the experience of catastrophic disruption, the need for a framework that makes suffering meaningful, the value of community in an atomized world. The Children of Adam have all of these. Their theology is coherent with their experience. The bombs fell, the world ended. Radiation killed most people and transformed others. In the context of living in the ruins of that catastrophe, the argument that radiation is divine and that the transformation it causes is a form of grace is not a symptom of mental illness, it's a coping mechanism. It's the story you tell yourself to make it through another day in a world that has every appearance of being beyond saving. The franchise's most persistent real-world inspiration, the one that underlies almost everything else, is the specific American relationship with nuclear weapons that developed in the years between Hiroshima and the end of the Cold War. That relationship was always psychologically contradictory. The weapons were simultaneously the proof of American technological supremacy, the ultimate guarantor of national security, and the thing that could end the world. The government's solution to the psychological stress of living with this contradiction was the same solution it applied to many uncomfortable facts. It managed the public's awareness of it through a combination of propaganda, reassurance, and deliberate obfuscation. The duck-and-cover drills that American schoolchildren were subjected to in the 1950s, which trained them to hide under their desks in the event of a nuclear attack, are satirized explicitly in the Fallout franchise, but they're also a symptom of the specific institutional dishonesty that the games examine more broadly. The government that ran those drills knew they were useless. The desks were not going to protect anyone from a nuclear weapon, but the drills served a different function. They normalized the idea that nuclear attack was something you could prepare for, something that could be survived with the right precautions, something that was ultimately manageable. They were exercises in the management of public psychology rather than in civil defense. The vaults are the drills at scale. They're the institutional commitment to the fiction that nuclear war is something you can plan for, that survival is possible, that the people in charge have taken care of things. They are, in the Fallout universe, equally useless as actual survival infrastructure because they were designed for something other than survival. But they serve the same function as the drills. They told people that someone was looking out for them and that if they followed the instructions, everything would be fine. War never changes. Neither does the way power talks to the people it governs. Section 12. The lore nobody talks about: loose threads and unanswered horrors. There are questions in the Fallout lore that don't have answers, not because the games forgot about them or because the developers were careless, but because they exist specifically as open wounds in the setting, things the player discovers and carries without resolution. These are the details that come back to you later, after you've moved on to something else. When you're doing something ordinary and a specific image or question surfaces from the back of your mind and doesn't quite go away, the glowing sea in Fallout 4 is the most radioactive location in the Commonwealth, a direct nuclear strike zone where the background radiation is high enough to be lethal without proper equipment, where the landscape has been burned into something that resembles the surface of another planet more than it resembles New England. The people who live there, primarily the children of Adam and the isolated survivor Virgil, exist in conditions that suggest the glowing sea should not be capable of supporting life at all. What the glowing sea conceals, buried in environmental storytelling and a few discoverable audio logs, is that the direct strike zone was home to a population center before the war. People lived there. The crater at the heart of the glowing sea, which the children of Adam have made their primary gathering place, was once a community. The skeletons that exist in various states of preservation throughout the sea are the remains of people who had no warning, who were simply present in a specific geographic location at the moment the bomb hit, and who were reduced to their most basic biological components by a weapon that someone pointed at their city and fired. Nobody remembers their names. Nobody in the wasteland knows who they were. The children of Adam have built a theology around the site of their deaths that transforms those deaths into divine will, which is either a form of memorial or the most profound possible insult to their memory, depending on how you look at it. The question of pre-war animal populations is one that players rarely think about, but which opens into something genuinely disturbing if you do. The death claws that stalk the wasteland are not natural creatures. They were engineered, a pre-war military project to create fast, aggressive, difficult-to-kill combat animals that could be deployed against enemy positions. The project worked. The death claws were deployed, or escaped, or both, and 2 centuries later, they are one of the most feared creatures in the wasteland. Animals that exist because a specific research team sat down and designed them to be as dangerous as possible. The thing about designed predators is that they were designed to kill specific things, probably enemy combatants in specific tactical situations. They were not designed for the open-ended ecological role they've been performing for 200 years. The Deathclaw's success as a species in the wasteland environment is not a triumph of nature. It's a continuing legacy of a weapons development program that nobody stopped and nobody cleaned up, and whose products are still running free. There is a similar story in the Scorched Plague that forms the central threat in Fallout 76. The Plague is a modified FEV strain that converts living creatures into aggressive, radiation fire-emitting monsters, and its origin is a secret military program that was conducting experiments in the Appalachian wilderness before the bombs fell. The program was almost certainly not the only one of its kind. The wasteland is full of things that exist because someone designed them to be dangerous, and then the war happened before anyone could contain them. The question of what happened to the people who designed these things is not one the games spend much time on. Presumably they died in the bombs, or in the vaults, or in the wasteland. But some of them probably had children. Some of those children probably survived. The institutional knowledge of what was designed, how it was designed, and how it could in theory be controlled or reversed exists somewhere in someone's memory or in a terminal in a bunker that hasn't been opened yet. Nobody in the wasteland is looking for it. They're too busy trying to survive what the last generation of designers left behind. The fate of China in Fallout's lore is one of the biggest unanswered questions in the franchise, and its absence from the games is one of their most meaningful structural choices. We know that the United States and China were at war. We know that American forces invaded through Anchorage. We know that the Great War ended the conflict in the most absolute way possible. What we don't know is what China looked like when the bombs fell, whether China had its own vault equivalent, whether there are Chinese survivors somewhere, whether there is a Chinese post-war civilization developing outside the game's geographic scope. The franchise has consistently kept China off-screen. The Chinese remnants encountered in Fallout 3 at Point Lookout and elsewhere are ghosts, soldiers who died in America during the war and whose spirits, the game implies, are still performing their last mission. The one place in the franchise where you can briefly inhabit a Chinese soldier's perspective is through a simulation, a recreation that's filtered through American military intelligence and may not accurately represent what the Chinese experience of the war was. This absence is pointed. Fallout is an American story told from an American perspective, and its refusal to engage with the Chinese dimension of its history is not a gap but a statement. We are very good at telling stories about ourselves, and the people we fight remain shadows. The Great War destroyed America in a way that is visible and documented and endlessly examined in the games. What it did to China exists outside the frame. The fate of the European Commonwealth is similarly absent. Europe had its own resource wars. The European Union, in Fallout lore, collapsed into internal conflict over energy resources before the Great War, and by the time the bombs fell, Europe was already in a state of significant political fragmentation. Did European cities survive? Are there European wastelands with their own factions and their own experiments with post-apocalyptic civilization? The games don't say. The world outside North America is functionally blank. The silence around the rest of the world is not simply a production limitation, although it is partly that. It's also a statement about the kind of story Fallout tells. It's a story about America, about the specific failure modes of the specific civilization that America became, about the things that America built and destroyed and left behind. The rest of the world is backdrop, which is itself a form of criticism. This is how American stories work. This is what American self-conception looks like. A nation that fills its own frame so completely that the rest of the world is simply not visible. The memory of pre-war popular culture preserved in the games, the music, the advertisements, the posters, the product packaging, is one of the franchise's most effective atmospheric tools, and also one of its most genuinely haunting elements. The songs that play on the game's radio stations are real songs. Inkspots and Andrews Sisters, big band jazz and crooner balladry, music from the 1940s and 1950s that carries the specific emotional weight of that era. Listening to them in the context of the wasteland creates a dissonance that is more than aesthetic. These songs were sung by real people. The people who recorded them lived during the years that Fallout's timeline draws from. They sang about love and longing and hope, and the texture of daily life, in a world that, in the game's universe, ended in nuclear fire. The music survived. The feelings it expressed survived. The world it was made in did not. There is something specifically aching about wandering through the ruins of a civilization and hearing its music still playing, still expressing the things its people felt and thought and hoped for, in a context where all of those feelings and thoughts and hopes have been reduced to ash and memory. The music in Fallout is not background. It's a voice from a world that is gone, still trying to tell you what it was. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer that every player character uses, is a piece of technology that was designed for Vault dwellers, specifically to help them manage their resources and track their health in the sealed environment of the Vault. The fact that it functions outside the Vault, that it remains a useful tool in the wasteland, is a small detail that contains within it the entire architecture of what Vault-Tec designed. The Pip-Boy was not designed for the survivors of the apocalypse. It was designed for the experiment subjects. The experiment subjects who survived and came out into the wasteland brought their experimental equipment with them, and the experimental equipment is now the most advanced personal technology in the world. The player character navigates the wasteland using tools that were designed to observe and document them. The Pip-Boy tracks health metrics, inventory, map data. In its original design context, that data was probably being transmitted to Vault-Tec's research systems. Whether it still is, whether there is any remaining system to receive it, is not something the games address. But the question is there. Who designed your tools? And what did they expect to do with the data your tools collect? The number 12 inches, the original Fallout, Necropolis, is built on the ruins of Bakersfield, California, a real city that exists in our timeline. The decision to name the vault that created it, Vault 12, and to place it under Bakersfield means that the ghouls of Necropolis are the survivors of a real city, people whose descendants might in our timeline be alive today. The franchise does this repeatedly, placing its fictional locations in real geographic contexts, which means that the catastrophe it describes, the extinction-level nuclear exchange that killed most of humanity, is positioned in relation to specific real places where specific real people live. This is a choice that most post-apocalyptic fiction avoids, actually telling you exactly where the bombs fell. Fallout tells you. It tells you that New England and Boston and Washington, D.C. and Nevada and California were hit, and it describes what those places look like 200 years later, and the specificity of it, the fact that it names real streets and real neighborhoods and real landmarks that exist in the real world, creates a specific relationship between the player and the catastrophe that a more abstractly located setting could not produce. You are walking through the ruins of places you can drive to. The vault under the hill outside Boston is the vault under the hill outside the actual Boston. The Washington Monument that the Brotherhood of Steel uses as a communications hub is the actual Washington Monument, 200 years removed from the moment you could stand at its base and look up at it in the sunlight. This is the ultimate horror that the franchise saves for last. The thing it holds in reserve until you've been immersed in its world long enough to stop seeing the pixels and start seeing the places. The wasteland isn't imaginary. It's very specifically our world, after a specific kind of ending. The people who built it lived in the same cities we live in. The institutions that failed them are recognizable versions of institutions we have. The arguments that led to the bombs being launched are versions of arguments that are still being made. War never changes. That's not a cynical observation. It's an invitation. An invitation to look at the specific war that is currently not changing, and the specific institutions that are currently not learning, and the specific choices that are currently being made by people who have convinced themselves that the consequences will be someone else's problem. The wasteland is patient. It will wait. Thank you for spending this time with the dark corners of Fallout's universe. If you found something in here that you didn't know before, or something that gave you that particular Fallout feeling, equal parts fascination and dread, drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying the channel, a subscription means the world and keeps this kind of deep dive content coming. There is so much more to explore. The wasteland runs deep. War never changes. But maybe we can. End of script. Section 13. The Master and the Philosophy of the Unity. There are villains in fiction who are easy to hate because they want simple, ugly things. Power, wealth, the pain of others for its own sake. And then there are the other kind. The ones who are harder to dismiss because they want something that almost makes sense, and whose tragedy is that the thing they want is built on a mistake so fundamental that by the time it becomes visible, thousands of people are already dead. The Master is the second kind. Richard Gray began as a human being, a traveler in the wasteland in the years shortly after the Great War, someone who survived the initial catastrophe and was doing the same thing most survivors were doing, moving through the ruins, scavenging, trying to understand the shape of the world that had been left to them. His path led him to the Mariposa military base, where the vats of FEV that the military had been developing were still active, still functioning, still ready to transform whatever living material came into contact with them. Gray fell in, or was pushed, or stumbled. The exact circumstances of his initial exposure are described differently in different sources, which is fitting for a transformation that was not supposed to happen to anyone, and that nobody recorded carefully because there was no one left who was supposed to be keeping records. The FEV didn't simply mutate him. It absorbed him, incrementally, over weeks and months, his consciousness persisting through a transformation that killed most of what he had been and rebuilt the remainder into something genuinely unprecedented. The thing that emerged from the vats was not a super mutant in the conventional sense, not the large, aggressive, simplified beings that the FEV had been producing at Mariposa during its official program. It was something that had retained its intelligence and gained new capabilities, a massively expanded brain mass, the ability to absorb other minds, psychic capabilities that the Fallout universe treats as a form of mental mutation produced by the virus's interaction with specific neural structures. What the Master had that other FEV experiments didn't have was time. By the time the player encounters him in Fallout 1, he has been growing, expanding, incorporating other beings into himself, and developing his philosophical framework for nearly a century. The biological entity that is the Master is large, anchored to the basement of what was once the Cathedral of the Children of the Cathedral. Draped in the biological material of the beings he has absorbed and integrated, a composite creature that is, in some physical sense, many people, and in a psychological sense, one highly unusual consciousness. The Unity is his project, and it is, in its own terms, a coherent response to a real problem. Gray had watched the wasteland for decades. He had seen what radiation and mutation were doing to the human gene pool. He had seen settlements struggling with food scarcity and resource competition, and the endemic violence of a civilization with no infrastructure and no law. He had concluded, based on this observation, that humanity in its current form was not going to make it. The biology was failing. The population was too small, too spread out, too vulnerable to the thousand things that killed people in the wasteland. Something had to change. His solution was the FEV. Super mutants were stronger than humans, more resistant to radiation, capable of surviving in conditions that killed ordinary people. If the entire human population could be converted to super mutants, the species would be stable. The weakness that made survival in the wasteland so difficult would be eliminated. Humanity would transform into something that could endure what the bombs had made of the world. What Gray had not fully investigated, what his research had not surfaced, was the sterility. Super mutants produced by the FEV are uniformly sterile. His Unity could convert the existing human population, but it could not produce new super mutants through reproduction. Within a generation, the Unity would be finished. The super mutant civilization he envisioned, stable and enduring, and superior to what humanity had been, was built on a foundation that would guarantee its own extinction. This is the fact the Vault Dweller can surface in a conversation with the Master in the game's climax. If the player has found the relevant research, has done the specific information gathering that makes the argument possible, they can present the evidence of super mutant sterility to the Master and watch him process it. The processing takes a moment. The Master has been working toward the Unity for most of a century. He has built an army. He has established a religion to provide his converts with a framework. He has spent decades in the conviction that he was doing the right thing, the necessary thing, the only thing that could save what remained of the human species. And then the argument lands, and the Master applies his extraordinary intelligence to it, and he can't find the flaw. The evidence is correct. The conclusion is correct. The Unity will fail. His response is to die. Not dramatically, not fighting, but by destroying the cathedral he is anchored to and himself with it. The Vault Dweller can finish the game this way, not by fighting the Master, but by talking to him. Not by defeating him, but by showing him that he was wrong. There is something uniquely devastating about a story that ends this way, partly because of what it says about the Master, and partly because of what it says about the Vault Dweller's victory. The Master was not evil in the sense of wanting to harm people. He was wrong about something fundamental, and everything built on that wrongness was doomed from the start. His death is not a moral victory. It's a tragedy, the story of an intelligence that was extraordinary in many ways and catastrophically wrong in one crucial way, and whose wrongness had been running for decades before the error was identified. The Master's cult, the Children of the Cathedral, who operated on the surface as a humanitarian organization providing medical assistance to wasteland communities while secretly working as a conversion front for the Unity, deserves its own examination. The Children of the Cathedral represent the Master's understanding of how you get people to accept what they would otherwise resist. You offer them something they need. You build trust, and you defer the uncomfortable revelation until the trust is strong enough to survive it. Many of the settlements that accepted medical assistance from the Children of the Cathedral had no idea what they were agreeing to. They were desperate people accepting help from a traveling organization of healer monks. The monks were, in many cases, genuine practitioners who provided genuine help. The organization behind the monks had a different agenda, but the help was real. This is the specific evil of the Children of the Cathedral, that it was not simply a deception, but a deception layered on top of something actually valuable. The people they helped were really helped. They were also being marked for eventual conversion. Some of the children were true believers who understood exactly what the Unity was and embraced it. Others were converts who had been through the transformation themselves and were now working to bring others in. Others were infiltrators who had been placed in the organization for specific purposes. And some were exactly what they appeared to be, people who wanted to help and had found an organization that claimed to be doing that. This is a structure that appears throughout history in organizations ranging from legitimate institutions that concealed dark practices to outright ideological movements that used genuine good works as a recruitment mechanism. The specific texture of the Children of the Cathedral, the way the outer shell of genuine humanitarian activity shields the inner purpose from examination, is one of the original Fallout's most pointed observations about how real-world ideological projects work. The Master's defeat does not end the children's activity because the children contain within them people who genuinely believed in the humanitarian mission, people who are going to continue doing medical work in the wasteland regardless of whether the Unity was ever a viable project. The victory over the Master is therefore not a clean, moral resolution. The organization that served his goals will continue, in altered form, as the followers of the Apocalypse, whose legitimate humanitarian work has been entangled from the beginning with a history that includes the Unity and everything it required. History is messier than victory conditions suggest. The Fallout franchise knows this. Section 14. The New California Republic and the Weight of Democracy. The New California Republic is probably the closest thing the Fallout franchise has to a straightforward good faction, and the fact that it's still deeply complicated says something important about the franchise's view of how human institutions actually work. The NCR was founded by descendants of the survivors of Vault-15 and the surrounding area, people who had spent decades building something functional from the ruins of California. By the time of Fallout 2, the NCR is a multi-state democracy with an elected government, a professional military, a legal system, and the basic infrastructure of a functioning modern civilization. Roads, currency, trade, law enforcement. In the context of the post-apocalyptic wasteland, this is genuinely extraordinary. Most of the wasteland's political formations are small, violent, and oriented toward immediate survival. The NCR has built something that looks like the world that existed before the bombs. The problem is that it has built something that looks like the world that existed before the bombs. The same dynamics that made the pre-war United States vulnerable are reasserting themselves in the NCR as it grows. Government corruption, corporate influence, political dysfunction, military overextension, economic inequality between the prosperous core settlements and the struggling frontier. The NCR is not a cautionary tale about democracy failing. It's a cautionary tale about democracy succeeding, building the institutions, running the processes, and then discovering that the institutions can be captured and the processes can be corrupted, and that the hard work of maintaining democratic accountability never actually ends. In Fallout, New Vegas, the NCR's position in the Mojave is a case study in imperial overextension. They arrived in the region because of Hoover Dam, which provides enormous hydroelectric power and fresh water, resources that are enormously valuable to an expanding state. They stayed because they couldn't figure out how to leave without looking weak and losing both the dam and the territory they'd already fought to control. The army is stretched, the supply lines are long, the soldiers are exhausted and underpaid, and increasingly aware that the republic they're defending is not adequately defending them in return. The writing for the NCR characters in New Vegas is particularly careful about this specific dynamic, the way that soldiers become cynical about the institutions they serve. Not because those institutions are bad, but because they are recognizably imperfect in ways that cost the soldiers personally while costing the politicians nothing. Sergeant Major Astor, the NCR officer commanding at the 188 Trading Post, describes the war against the Legion in terms that are explicitly not heroic. It's a resource competition that the Republic has decided is necessary, and soldiers are the resource it's spending to compete. The NCR's relationship with the followers of the Apocalypse, the humanitarian research organization that has been a presence in the Fallout universe since the original game, is one of the more interesting political subplots in New Vegas. The followers operate in the Mojave as a neutral humanitarian organization, providing medical assistance and research support to anyone who needs it regardless of faction. The NCR has been attempting to bring the followers under its institutional umbrella for years, essentially to gain control of their medical capabilities and their research output for strategic purposes. The followers' resistance to this is principled and pragmatic. They believe that the moment they become an NCR asset, their ability to serve Legion-held communities and NCR hostile populations ends, which means they can no longer be the thing they are. The NCR's position is that in the current conflict, neutrality is a luxury that practical people can't afford. Both positions are defensible, and the game doesn't resolve which is right, because in the real world, this argument between humanitarian neutrality and political alignment happens constantly and never reaches a clean resolution either. The International Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières have versions of this debate internally and externally all the time. The Fallout franchise plants it in the Mojave and lets it run. The Bitter Springs Massacre, which is referenced in multiple New Vegas quests and which forms the backstory for the companion Boone, is one of the franchise's clearest-eyed looks at what military institutions do when institutional momentum meets incomplete information. The Great Khans were a raider tribe in the Mojave, historically violent and hostile to the NCR. After a series of attacks on NCR camps, the Republic's military responded with an operation at Bitter Springs, a camp where a large number of Khans were gathered. The intelligence was wrong. The people at Bitter Springs were not a military force preparing to attack. They were the tribe's non-combatants. The elderly, the sick, the women who weren't raiders, the children. The NCR soldiers, including Boone, who was a skilled sniper positioned to engage targets, received the order to fire. They fired. Many of the people at Bitter Springs died. Boone carries this with him as a wound that has not closed, and the game, through his companion questline, explores the specific texture of survivors' guilt and moral injury in a way that is unusually careful for a video game. Boone is not simply sad. He is damaged in a specific way. He made a decision in a moment he cannot revise, based on information that was incorrect, following orders from an institution he trusted, and people died who should not have died. The institution has not been held accountable. The officers who gave the incorrect orders have not been prosecuted. The Republic has moved on. This is the pattern. The institution makes mistakes. The mistakes kill people. The institution continues. The people who executed the mistakes carry them. The structure that created the conditions for the mistakes remains unchanged because changing it would require the institution to acknowledge that the structure was the problem, and institutions are very good at acknowledging individual failures while protecting structural ones. What makes the NCR genuinely admirable, despite all of this, is that it is aware of its own failures in a way that most of the Wasteland's other political formations are not. NCR characters who are critical of the Republic are not persecuted or silenced. Chief Hanlon's campaign to falsify intelligence reports, driven by his genuine belief that the NCR is sacrificing soldiers in a strategic situation that cannot be won, is a form of internal dissent that the game presents as sympathetic even while acknowledging it as wrong. The Republic is corrupt and overextended and failing in specific ways, and NCR characters say so publicly, argue about it internally, and continue to work within the system while trying to change it. That's democracy as it actually exists. Messy, contested, never finished, never clean, producing outcomes that are frequently unsatisfying and occasionally terrible, but maintaining enough internal accountability that the failures can be identified and the arguments can be made. The NCR is the franchise's most honest portrait of what building civilization actually looks like, and the portrait is not flattering, but it is, ultimately, the thing that most resembles something worth saving. The question of what comes after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, regardless of which faction wins, is explored in the game's ending slides. What those slides describe is futures, not conclusions. Futures where the NCR continues to struggle with its contradictions, where the Republic attempts to consolidate its gains and finds that the same problems that plagued the old America are growing in its institutions, where the fight for the Mojave turns out to have been one battle in a much longer war over what kind of civilization the wasteland will rebuild. There is no slide that shows everything having worked out. The franchise doesn't deal in that currency. Section 15. Holotapes, Terminals, and the Voices of the Dead. One of the Fallout franchise's most distinctive storytelling techniques is the use of holotapes and terminal entries to deliver its most affecting material. While the main quests and faction narratives carry the franchise's large-scale themes, it's in these small, incidental documents that the franchise does its most intimate work, telling you about specific people in specific moments, whose lives ended and whose words survived. These are not famous people. They're not quest givers or faction leaders or legendary figures. They're the texture of the world, the accumulated voices of a civilization that ended, And the fact that you can read their words 200 years after they wrote them creates a specific relationship between the player and the past that nothing else in the franchise quite replicates. There is a holotape in Fallout 3 from a woman named Mary who was sealed in Vault 101 as a child and who recorded her thoughts at intervals throughout her life. The tapes span decades. They document marriage, motherhood, aging, the slow accumulation of the ordinary experiences that constitute a life. The final tape is recorded when she is very old, and it is about the vault's door, which she has never seen open and which she has come to understand will never open in her lifetime. She is at peace with this. She has had a good life within the space that was given to her, and she is going to die in the vault she was born in. And she is talking to the tape recorder because there is something she wants to say to whoever might someday hear it. The tape is in a lunchbox. You find it by exploring. No quest marker leads you there. Most players who encounter it probably don't realize what they've found until they've listened to it, and by then they're already inside her voice, inside the specific cadence of an old woman talking to a machine because the machine might outlast her, which is also what we all do every time we write anything down. In Fallout New Vegas, the Mojave Outpost has a recording made by an NCR soldier who has been stationed at a particularly boring and uncomfortable posting. He records himself complaining about the food, the weather, the sand, the rations, the absence of anything interesting happening, and the way the days blur together into a kind of military beige. He is very funny. He is also, if you look at his body, very dead, killed at some point after the recording by something that left no obvious trace. The recording captures a living person in the middle of the ordinary texture of their life. The body shows you that the texture ended. This juxtaposition, the living voice and the dead body, is one of the franchise's fundamental aesthetic moves, and it works every time because it captures something that is genuinely true about how the present moment relates to the future. You never know when you're making the last recording. Every holotape you find was made by someone who expected to keep living afterward, who was in the middle of something and put it down intending to pick it back up. The terminal entries in the Dunwich building in Fallout 3, and later the Dunwich Borer's location in Fallout 4, represent the franchise's most explicit engagement with Lovecraftian horror, a layer of deep supernatural dread that sits underneath the nuclear catastrophe. The Dunwich entries document a real estate development company's increasing awareness that the land they have purchased has a history that predates the pre-war civilization, that the site was used for something by some earlier group of people, that the stone beneath the building has been shaped in ways that should not be possible, and that the people who work on the site are experiencing things that have no rational explanation. The Lovecraftian layer in Fallout is deliberately kept at the margins, suggested rather than confirmed, because the franchise's primary horror register is realist rather than supernatural. But the Dunwich material, and certain other scattered locations in the franchise, maintain the possibility that underneath the human catastrophe of the Great War, underneath the institutional failures and the political violence and the scientific hubris, there is something else, something older, something that was there before the humans arrived and that will be there after them. This possibility is never confirmed or denied. It exists as a question mark in the corner of the franchise's world, a place where the rational framework that the games otherwise maintain starts to develop cracks. What was in the Dunwich pit before the building was built? What do the people who descend deep enough into the structure encounter that changes them in the specific ways the terminal entries describe? The franchise doesn't answer. Some doors are better left with question marks. The most expansive use of personal document storytelling in the franchise is probably in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, where the history of the island is told through a layered series of written and recorded documents spanning the period from before the Great War to the present day. Through these documents, the player pieces together the history of the island's original pre-war community, the ways the war affected them specifically, the development of the Children of Adam's presence, the founding of the Far Harbor settlement, and the slow escalation of the conflict that the player arrives to try to resolve. What makes this storytelling effective is the way it places specific human voices at each stage of the historical progression. You don't just know that the island was settled after the war. You know who settled it, what they were hoping for, what they were afraid of, what mistakes they made, who they loved. You know the names of the people who made the decisions that led to the current situation. The conflict between Far Harbor and the Children of Adam is not an abstract faction conflict. It's the latest iteration of a decades-long argument between specific people, many of them dead, whose choices shaped a situation that their descendants are now trying to survive. This approach to history, as something made by specific people in specific moments, rather than by large impersonal forces, is one of the franchise's most sophisticated historiographical choices. The great forces are real. The resource wars, the Great War, the ecological transformation of the planet by radiation, all of these shape everything. But within those forces, people make choices, and those choices matter, and the choices of people who are long dead continue to determine the options available to people who are currently alive. The holotapes in the ruins of the suburban houses scattered throughout the wasteland, the ones that were recorded in the minutes and hours before the bombs hit, are the franchise's most direct confrontation with the human cost of the Great War. Some of them are from people who didn't know what was coming. Others are from people who did. A father leaving a message for his children, trying to explain where the emergency supplies are in the basement. A woman describing the light on the horizon and not knowing what it is. A man who has looked up nuclear explosion on his terminal and is now very quietly recording himself saying goodbye to people who will never hear it. These are fictional documents, but they are constructed with enough specificity and enough emotional truth that the distinction between fiction and documentation doesn't fully hold when you're listening to them. They are what we all fear, made audible. The moment when the thing you didn't believe would happen begins to happen, and the time to prepare is over, and all that's left is what you say to the people you love in the time remaining. The franchise has made these recordings over and over again, in game after game, and they never lose their power, because what they're documenting is not specific to the Fallout universe. The feeling is universal. The specific catastrophe is fictional. The specific grief is not. Section 16, The Long Shadow of Mariposa. There is one location in the entire Fallout franchise that functions as the origin point for more of its darkness than any other. Mariposa Military Base in California, the facility where the forced evolutionary virus was being developed before the bombs fell, and where Roger Maxson discovered what the project entailed and made the decision that would lead to the Brotherhood of Steel. Mariposa is the place where multiple threads converge. The FEV created at Mariposa became the super mutants of Fallout 1. The soldiers who discovered what was happening at Mariposa became the Brotherhood of Steel. The scientific knowledge developed at Mariposa eventually spread to Vault-87, the Institute's FEV program, and various other projects across the franchise. Mariposa is the franchise's original sin, the place where someone made a decision about using human beings as research subjects that, in one form or another, has been echoing through the wasteland for over 200 years. The FEV itself has a history that extends back before Mariposa to Vault-Tec research, where the forced evolutionary virus was first developed under the Project Pandora umbrella, which was itself one component of a larger government research initiative called the Pan-Immunity Virion Project. The official purpose of this research was the development of a universal vaccine capable of protecting human subjects against any pathogen, which was a plausible and genuinely valuable goal during the years of the resource wars when biological warfare was a serious military concern. The FEV's development as a tool for creating super soldiers, rather than simply a vaccine, represents a shift in the project's purpose that occurred at some point during its classified history. The specific moment when someone looked at the Pan-Immunity Virion Project and said, "What if instead of protecting existing humans, we transform them into something better?" is not documented in the franchise. It happened in a classified context, in a room full of people with security clearances, and whoever said it was not thinking about the Mariposa prisoners, or the vaults, or the wasteland that would be generated by the project's eventual consequences. They were thinking about military advantage. The FEV testing at Mariposa used military prisoners, people who had no say in whether they participated, who were not informed of the risks, who were simply selected from the existing pool of people the institution had complete authority over and subjected to the experiment. This is the specific moral horror that Maxson encountered when he arrived at the base. Not abstract government wrongdoing, but a room full of people experiencing something terrible that they had not agreed to, for the benefit of an institution that had decided their consent was irrelevant. His response, killing the scientist who invoked the defense of following orders, is often presented in the franchise as the founding act of the Brotherhood's morality, the moment when a specific person decided that there were things he was not willing to do and institutions he was not willing to serve, regardless of what he was told the orders required. But the full weight of the moment requires acknowledging what came after. Maxon executed a scientist and declared his unit's independence from the government 3 days before the nuclear apocalypse that the government had been helping to engineer. He was not wrong, and his decision was genuinely admirable, but he was also not early enough to stop anything. The experiments at Mariposa had been running long enough to produce the knowledge that would propagate through the wasteland for generations. The prisoners in the vats at Mariposa, the people who were being transformed into super mutants by the FEV, were still in the vats when the bombs fell. Some of them probably survived the transformation. Some of those probably eventually escaped or were released. The first super mutants that the Vault Dweller encounters in Fallout 1 are the descendants of a program that Maxon exposed and abandoned, and they are doing to other people what was done to the original subjects at Mariposa. This is not a coincidence. This is how damage propagates. The original harm creates a population that perpetuates the harm. Not because they are evil, but because the harm has become their nature, and their nature drives them toward the same behaviors that created them. The super mutant who dunks a new victim in an FEV vat is doing exactly what was done to him, or to someone in his lineage, and the institution that originally made the decision to run the program is long gone and faces no accountability. Accountability in the Fallout franchise is consistently posthumous and insufficient. The people who made the decisions that created the wasteland died in the bombs. The institutions that made those decisions were destroyed. What remained was the physical and biological and chemical legacy of those decisions, still active, still propagating, still shaping the world 2 centuries later. The people living in that world had no part in creating the conditions that govern them. They are dealing with consequences they didn't author, and the authors are beyond reach. This is the franchise's deepest and most sustained political observation, that the people who bear the cost of decisions are very often not the people who made them. The resource wars were decided in boardrooms and government offices by people who had bunkers. The bombs were targeted by people who had shelters. The Vault experiments were designed by people who had their own separate facility with a proper food supply and no sociological manipulation built into the walls. The catastrophe fell on the people who had the least input into whether it happened and the least protection against it when it did. 200 years later, their descendants are still paying the bill. The people who ran up the bill are long dead. The bill remains. Section 17. The vaults we haven't seen and what they might contain. The franchise has documented a substantial number of vault experiments across its various games, but the math leaves something to consider. 122 vaults were built. The games and supplemental materials have documented, to varying degrees, somewhere between 30 and 40 of them. That leaves between 80 and 90 vaults whose experiments are unknown, whose population's fates are undocumented, whose doors, in theory, still exist somewhere in the American continent, with whatever is behind them still behind them. This is not a plot hole. It's a structural feature of the franchise's world building, an acknowledgement that the wasteland is larger than any individual story can encompass, that the archive of human catastrophe is far bigger than what can be accessed, and that the darkness the games show you is not all of the darkness. Some of those unknown vaults are certainly empty. Their populations either died in the experiment or eventually left, and the vault is a ruin with nothing left but residue. But statistically, given what we know about the range of experiments, some of those unknown vaults are probably still operating, in whatever form 200 years of isolation has left them. Some of them may have populations that have been in continuous occupation since the Great War, living under whatever conditions the original experiment imposed, possibly not knowing that the war ended 2 centuries ago and that there is a world outside. The Fallout 76 lore reveals something about this in a backhanded way. Some of the Appalachian vaults had sealed populations that were not informed about the progress of the wasteland outside, and some of those populations developed in ways that were shaped entirely by their sealed conditions and the experiments they didn't know were being run on them. The franchise has occasionally hinted at vaults that are too dark to fully explore. Vault 92's experiment, which drove musicians to violence through white noise, is documented, but its final state is not made fully explicit in the shipped games. There are references to vaults where the population simply killed each other within the first few years, where the experiment was something that could only produce a specific catastrophic outcome, and the researchers noted the outcome and closed the book and moved on. There are references to vaults designed with such perverse internal logic that survival was effectively impossible, where the experiment was essentially whether people would die quickly or slowly, and the only result was the specific rate of death. These are the stories the franchise hasn't told yet. They exist in the space between the documented vaults, in the darkness of the 100+ sealed doors that nobody in the franchise's storylines has gotten around to opening. Some of those doors are better left closed, which is also a kind of answer to the question of why they haven't been opened. The franchise knows when to allow the imagination to do the work that explicit depiction cannot. The vaults that are described as control vaults, the 17 that were supposedly properly stocked and intended to function as advertised, have their own complications. The supplemental materials note that most of the control vaults, when they eventually opened, had universally horrific results, a phrase that covers a lot of possible history without specifying any of it. Vault 3 Inches. New Vegas was a control vault that opened 20 years after the war, and its residents emerged into the wasteland and were slaughtered by raiders. The control vault design protected its residents from Vault-Tec's deliberate experiments. It didn't protect them from the world that Vault-Tec helped create. The vaults that were designed to be opened at specific times, when the surface conditions had improved to a point where survival was feasible, faced the problem that the system that was supposed to send the all-clear signal was part of a government that no longer exists. The vaults that waited for an official signal to open are waiting for something that will never come. Some of them are probably still waiting. A sealed vault with functioning life support systems, with a population that has been told to wait for the signal 2 centuries after the signal was supposed to come. What happens to a community that has been waiting for permission that will never arrive? Some communities, like Vault 101, have built cultures around the idea that waiting is the only appropriate response. Others, presumably, reached a point where the weight of waiting became intolerable, and someone finally opened the door, regardless of the signal. Those communities found the wasteland. Whether the wasteland was ready for them is a separate question. Section 18. War Never Changes. A Final Meditation. The line that opens every Fallout game, delivered as a spoken narration against a backdrop of burning cities or ruined landscapes, is 3 words. War never changes. It's a statement simple enough to dismiss, grand enough to feel important, specific enough to mean something if you think about it for more than a few seconds. What does it mean that war never changes? The easy reading is pessimistic. Humans are violent, conflict is inevitable, every civilization ends the same way. This reading makes the Fallout franchise into a nihilistic statement about human nature, a gesture at the eternal recurrence of the same violence in new clothes. The pre-war civilization built war. The wasteland builds war. The factions built from the ashes of the old world build new wars. All of it is the same thing, endlessly repeating. But the franchise itself doesn't fully commit to this reading. The evidence against it is in the details. The fact that there are, in every game, people who choose something other than war. The followers of the apocalypse. The settlers who build communities. The merchants who trade instead of raid. The doctors who treat the wounded regardless of faction. These people are not naive about the world they live in. They know what war is. They have seen it, lived in it, lost things to it, and they choose, daily, to do something else. The franchise's deepest political statement is not in the opening narration. It's in the existence of the followers of the apocalypse as a recurring institution across the franchise. People who decided that the response to the end of civilization was not to build a new version of what ended, but to do the basic work of keeping people alive and knowledge preserved until the conditions for something better exist. They don't have power armor. They don't control dams. They have medical supplies and books, and they keep moving, and they keep treating people who need treatment, and they keep teaching people who want to learn. The game doesn't reward them with political victory. No ending slide in any Fallout game gives the followers final control of the wasteland. Their influence is diffuse, incremental, easy to miss in the broad movements of faction conflict, but they're there in every game, and their continued existence in a world this brutal is its own kind of statement. War never changes, but the followers are always there, running their clinic in the ruins of whatever just burned, treating the wounded from both sides, arguing with each other about what counts as neutrality and what counts as complicity, making mistakes, occasionally being killed for their trouble, showing up again the next day. That's not nothing. In the Fallout universe, in the real world, in any world, it's not nothing. The darkness of Fallout is not the franchise's final word. It's the setting, the texture, the air, the stories breathe. The final word is different, and it's harder to hold on to because it requires looking at the Vault experiments and the super mutant factories and Caesar's Legion and the Enclave and all the rest of the darkness, and still finding the followers in it, still finding the moments where someone chose to treat a patient instead of walking away, still finding the places where the ordinary human preference for not dying and not being alone persists against everything the wasteland can throw at it. War never changes, people sometimes do. That tension between the institutional momentum of destruction and the persistent, stubborn, ordinary human preference for something else is what makes Fallout worth playing and worth thinking about and worth spending 3 hours in a dark room with your headphones on, absorbing. Because the wasteland is patient, it will wait. But so will the followers. And sometimes, that's enough to make a difference. End of script. Total runtime target, approximately 3 hours of narration at standard pace. Bonus. The ones who never made it out, forgotten stories of the wasteland. There is a specific category of Fallout character that the franchise returns to repeatedly in different games, in different contexts, with different names, but always with the same essential profile. The person who almost made it. The survivor who built something real, who got further than most people do, who came close enough to something good that losing it had weight. Billy Peabody trapped in a refrigerator for 200 years is one version of this. Survival without agency, persistence without purpose, waiting in a dark box for a world that kept turning without him. But when you find him and help him find his family, the story doesn't end there. His parents are alive, ghoulified, wandering. They had each other for most of those 200 years, which is more than most people have. The reunion is genuinely warm. And then the game moves on, because the wasteland doesn't pause to let you savor warmth for very long. The residents of Arafu in Fallout 3, a small settlement built on an elevated highway overpass, are another version. They built their community on a structure that put them above the wasteland's floor-level dangers, a practical vertical adaptation that required engineering knowledge and collective effort to maintain. The settlement is small and vulnerable, but it exists, which is more than can be said for most of the settlements whose ruins the player walks through. What threatens them in the relevant questline is not a rival faction or a super mutant army. It's a small group of people who have been changed by trauma and circumstances into something that their former community can't accommodate. Ian West, who left Arafu and joined the family, a group of former humans who have adopted a vampire aesthetic and lifestyle in response to their shared experience of violence and its effects on their psychology, represents the specific kind of departure from community that the wasteland produces. Not a betrayal, not a rejection, but a recognition that the person he had become could not safely coexist with the community he loved. His departure was an act of protection. The community experienced it as abandonment. This dynamic, the person who leaves because staying would harm the people they care about, appears throughout the franchise in various forms. The companion stories in every game contain versions of it. Boone left the NCR Rangers after the Bitter Springs Massacre. Lily Bowen, the Nightkin companion in New Vegas, left her grandchildren because she had become too dangerous to be near them. Dance, in Fallout 4, must eventually reckon with the possibility that his presence among the people he considers family is built on a lie about what he is. These departures are not heroic sacrifices. They're quieter and more painful than that. The decision made by people who understand that love sometimes requires absence, that belonging is not always compatible with safety, that the wasteland's most personal violence is sometimes the space between people who cannot be together. The settlers who built Minefield in Fallout 3, the location whose name is exactly what it sounds like, chose to protect their land from raiders by surrounding it with an elaborate series of mines and traps. The protection worked. The raiders stayed away. The people who built the defenses also stayed away, in the end, driven out by the same traps that protected them or simply unable to maintain a community in a location that was functionally inaccessible. The mines are still active when the player arrives. The settlement is empty. The defenses outlasted the defenders. There is something in that image that captures something true about how protection mechanisms work, not just in the wasteland, but in any context where the tools built to guard something eventually become the barrier between the people being protected and the things they're being protected for. The mines are there. The community is not. The protection is perfect and completely useless. The water merchants in the Mojave, ordinary people who have built businesses around transporting fresh water from purification sources to communities that can't produce their own, are one of the franchise's quieter portraits of economic life in the wasteland. They're not heroes. They're not villains. They're people who identified a need, built a supply chain, hired muscle for protection, and are trying to make enough to survive in the specific way that running a business in the post-apocalypse requires. They have the same preoccupations as merchants in any environment: inventory, competitors, prices, reliability of supply, reliability of demand. What makes them specifically wasteland figures is the product. They're selling water. The most basic requirement for biological survival, the thing that no living person can do without for more than a few days, has become a commodity in the Fallout economy, controlled by whoever has access to the purification infrastructure and the logistical network to distribute it. This is not a satire. This is a straightforward economic description of how essential goods work in the absence of public infrastructure. They become private goods, and private goods are controlled by whoever has the capital to own the infrastructure that produces them. The people who can't afford to pay the water merchants in the Mojave, the communities and individuals who are too poor or too remote to participate in the water economy, die of thirst. Not dramatically, not in a narrative sense that the games track. They just stop being in the story because the story doesn't have time for everyone who died outside its frame. The franchise's most consistent ethical position, the one it maintains across all its games and all its development teams, is that the people outside the frame matter. The people who die between quests, the communities that fail between the player's visits, the settlers who get raided while the player character is in a different region, all of these people existed and their existence had weight, and the fact that the game cannot show all of it doesn't mean it isn't there. This is why the holotapes matter so much. They are the franchise's attempt to represent the unrepresentable, the specific human experience of the specific people who make up the world, most of whom the player will never meet, many of whom are dead before the story begins. The holotape is a voice from outside the frame, insisting that the frame is not the whole picture. That insistence is the heart of the franchise. Underneath all the factions and the experiments and the darkness and the humor and the power armor and the retro-futurist aesthetics, the heart of Fallout is that it keeps asking you to pay attention to the people outside the frame and to consider what it means that they're there, and to ask why the frame is drawn where it is and who drew it and who benefits from the people outside it staying invisible. The wasteland is patient. The voices in the holotapes are still speaking. The terminals still hold their last entries, waiting for someone to read them. You found this. You're listening. That's more than most of the people in those tapes ever got.